We're having a little technical difficulties, and so as we work on this, you will be contacted by Ginger Gossman or Wanda Carr to get you linked up so that by the time you present, we're ready for you. Which seems odd to say because I've never actually met this person. Sorry, I hope you can hear me. So having said that, I will turn it over to Zelma so she can get the party started.
Okay, well, good morning. My name is Zelma DeLeon, and I'm from the University of North Texas, and I'm also the chair of the Financial Advisory Committee. I would like to welcome all of you today. Today is March 8th, and the time is 9:31. We're ready to begin the meeting, but before we do, I would like for each of you to introduce yourselves and also indicate where you're from. So if we can start over here with Terry.
Gentlemen, and I'm with
Kara Tappendorf, Pflugerville ISD.
Good morning, Christopher Murr, Texas State University, and also president of the Texas Association of Student Financial Aid Administrators.
Matthew Vandermoss, a student at the Texas College of Osteopathic Medicine, University of North Texas Health Science Center.
Kathy Sanchez with the University of North Texas Health Science Center.
Chad Pulse here at the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board.
Delisa Fox, Texas A&M University Health Science Center.
Dana Mingo, Paul Quinn College, Dallas.
Diane Todd Sprague, University of Texas at Austin.
Peggy Watts, Temple College.
Carla Flores, the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley.
Samantha Stoniker, Tarrant County College.
Billy Satterfield, University of Houston, Clear Lake.
Christine Stewart Carruthers, Texas State Technical College.
The one without a mic, Alan Pixley, Collin College.
Jeannie Gage, Texas A&M University, Corpus Christi.
I'm Mike Scott.
Robert Marino, National College.
Brent Williford, Blinn College.
And for the first time, we don't have anybody on the phone. The last time it was December 8th, and it was a snow day, so we had several that could not attend the meeting. So this is great news that we have everybody here. So thank you. And also welcome to those that are listening online. Before we start, I would like to just give some reminders. If you're going to speak, be sure and press the button on the mic. And Alan, you'll have to stretch some to do yours. You'll share, Jenny. Okay. If you have cell phones, please put those on silent. If you have to take a break, feel free to get up. The restrooms are just right around the corner. We will determine later if we will break for lunch or if we're going to work through lunch. And in front of you, you'll find your agenda and also the handouts. So are there any questions before we get started? No? Okay. All right. So the first agenda item is the consideration of approval of minutes. You have those in front of you. If you can please look at them if you haven't already read them. And let me know if you have any edits or any questions. Okay. Do I have a motion to approve the minutes of December 8th?
I'll make a motion to approve the minutes as is from December 8th.
Okay, Delisa has the first motion. Second?
Second.
Oh, okay, Jenny. Okay, all in favor? Aye. Okay, none opposed, so the motion has passed. Thank you. And I have to say, that's the first time, too, that we haven't had any edits, so thank you. Okay, so now we're at Agenda Item C, Update Prior Business, and I'm going to turn it over to Chad. It's prior FAAC business.
Great. I looked over the agendas from the past couple meetings to identify anything that was kind of still outstanding. One item that we had talked about that I wanted to give you an update on was negotiated rulemaking. Committees have been assembled for Texas Grant, TEOG, and TEG that are focused on providing institutions with more flexibility in the use of their funding. Looking at things like providing biennial funding levels, allowing institutions the full spring semester to be able to manage their allocation, as well as providing the preliminary steps that would allow institutions to even be able to use their funding during the summer as well. Providing allocation increases much earlier in the academic year, probably like October versus March, so that institutions can address student needs more effectively. And equitably distributing excess funding across all institutions early in the academic year, rather than focusing just on those institutions making requests late in the year. The TEOG meetings are set for April 12th and 13th. TEG is the 16th, and Texas Grant is the 18th. If anyone's wondering why there's two TEOG meetings, it's because there's two TEOG appropriations, one for community colleges and one for technical and public state colleges, so we have to have two different negotiated rulemakings for those. So those are moving forward, and we will keep you informed as those occur. There were 4 additional items that I saw in looking back, all 4 of which have their own agenda item. One was the student loan letter, which we'll be covering in agenda item E. There was the potential legislative ideas, which agenda items F and G will cover. Records retention, which we'll talk about in agenda item H, and then discussion about user access verification feedback and what we can do with that, and I'll mention that when we get to agenda item L. So those were the prior business items. Was there any prior business that someone had hoped I was going to mention that I didn't?
Not prior business, but could you tell me the date of the TEG meeting again?
The TEG meeting is April 16th.
16th, thanks.
Yep.
And the Texas Grant is April 18th?
18th, yep.
Okay. All right, thank you. Okay. All right, well, looks like we're ready to move on to the next agenda item, which is a presentation, the Emergency Aid Network. We have Monique Lee Whitley. She's with the coordinating board. She's a program coordinator with Emergency Aid Network. And we also have Dr. Teresa Riley. She's the Senior Vice President for Student Affairs and University Administration at Texas A&M University, Kingsville. So welcome.
Thank you, and thank you, committee, for letting us present today. Thank you. The Emergency Aid Network is about 3 million students nationwide, or just one broken tooth, dead battery, or travel to a funeral away from dropping out. You can see that some of these emergencies could be small, just such as, like I said, a dead battery or a flat tire. And because of these small emergencies, 60 by 30 has poised Texas for understanding the benefits and impact emergency aid programs can have on persistence, completion, and student debt. So that's why the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation created a grant to study best practices and policies relating to emergency aid in Texas. It was developed into the Advocating for Emergency Aid in Texas project. There are 4 phases to the project: the landscape analysis, the network launch, awareness and dissemination, and advocacy. Phase 1, the activities. The coordinating board sent a survey to 178 institutions, both 2- and 4-year public and private institutions, to provide a deeper understanding of emergency aid practices in the state. Our response rate was 80%. The coordinating board, the Texas Higher Education Emergency Aid in Texas survey leveraged national data collection and research on emergency aid completed by NASPA. We borrowed their information, and our survey solicited information on emergency aid practices related to financial literacy and the use of data to identify those in need of services. Findings from this survey informed selection of the emergency aid network, the agendas of the EANet meeting, and subsequent recommendations from the network. Dr. Teresa Riley is part of this network. Project outcomes for Phase 1 are the survey findings that complement the national survey with robust data on institutional practices regarding emergency aid and financial literacy in Texas. Phase 2, from the survey responses, the coordinating board invited 10 institutions with significant underrepresented minority populations and existing emergency aid programs, ensuring a diversity of representation by sector, system, and location. Each of the 10 emergency aid network institutions have designated 4 to 5 staff members from student services, financial aid, and other departments to comprise their team. The newly formed EANet is identifying strategies and best practices that help promote policies and processes for effective emergency aid and financial literacy programs in Texas, as well as any barriers that may exist from current policy concerning emergency aid. Project outcomes for Phase 2 are that a network of informed 2- and 4-year public institutions and systems to operate as a learning community that will offer recommendations for changes in policy and practice. And here you can see that a map of the institutions that are involved in the network, and I'm happy to say that 4 of these institutions are represented on this committee today. 7 of the 8 systems in Texas are also represented on this committee. So welcome and thank you for your participation in the EANet. So Phase 3, awareness and dissemination. The EANet will make presentations to the advisory committee, which we're doing today, and then we also did one back in November to the Financial Literacy Advisory Committee. We are also hosting a statewide convening, inviting all institutions, nonprofit organizations, and philanthropists statewide to attend. Goals of the meeting will be to share best practices in emergency aid and financial literacy, to provide a draft of recommendations, and also to give other institutions an opportunity to provide input on these recommendations. We are inviting institutions to apply for mini grants to enhance their existing programs to better reflect best practices. Project outcomes for Phase 3 are that enhanced and improved emergency aid and financial literacy programs statewide will align with design principles for exemplary programs. So Phase 4, advocacy. It is the hope of the EANet that the coordinating board will incorporate EANet policy recommendations as a standing item on the coordinating board's legislative and government relations briefings. Survey findings and EANet final recommendations will be disseminated via the coordinating board's official channels of communication. Project outcomes for Phase 4 are that promotion of policy and best practices to support effective emergency aid and financial literacy programs will happen. So, where are we now? I'll let Dr. Riley take over.
Okay, thank you so much. Good morning. I'm very happy to be here with all of you today and very pleased to join Monique in this really important work. Where are we now? One of the things that we actually began with was defining an emergency. As an emergency aid network, you can imagine we all had very different ideas about what an emergency really constitutes in our lives, but also had to put ourselves in the shoes of our students. Quite literally, as Monique earlier said, everything from, that flat tire or the dead battery on a car that keeps you from making it to class or to a test on time, those are real emergencies in the lives of students, where for us it might not be considered the big family emergency. So the EANet, we met and had some great discussions about how would we define this. We worked through some various working groups, if you will. And so you're going to see in front of you the definition that we have created, but have not all universally yet adopted. So I think that's really important to note. So our definition, an unexpected or unforeseen expense, event, or circumstance that could cause a loss of momentum towards student success. So we all were challenged. Do we think about this in terms of student retention, persistence, graduation? Do we think about it, in what measurements do we think of success? And I think every institution's thinking about that a little bit differently. But for those that have emergency aid programs, they're actually reporting on whatever those measures of success are for their students. For us, it could be grade point average, as well as persistence to degree completion. So although the 10 have not all universally adopted the definition, it is very, very similar across our institutions already. What typical programs are out there to help in case of emergency? One of the things that we learned from the surveys that we conducted and with our emergency aid network was that approximately 40% of Texas institutions did not have any kind of emergency grant or loan program already established. Texas A&M University Kingsville was one of those. So when I actually responded to the survey and Monique said, "You've been selected," I thought, I have so little to contribute. I'm not sure why our institution was selected. But the truth is, it was for a great reason. It was because we needed to be thinking along these paths. And many of the institutions were much further ahead. So we've been learning from each other throughout this process. But for the 60, some, or a little less than 60% that had emergency aid programs, they already had named programs. Some had been set up through their foundations or through financial aid. They could be in the forms of grants or loans. And some of them had incredibly clever names already chosen. So one of the things Monique pointed out is Texas A&M Kingsville were the Hogs, Javelinas, and the Hog loan had already been taken. So our institutions have a great deal of creativity and thought put behind how they'll market these so that students know what they are, but then also that students do not feel stigmatized by getting help from these organizations or from these entities. And I think that's really important. So survey responses. One of the things, and I mentioned this to you before, my institution didn't have an emergency aid program. And we were asked to define for ourselves, what is our answer to this question? If you don't have a program, why not, and are you interested? So really, was it no, but we're planning? We're actually in the planning stages. Or was it no, but we're really interested, we just don't know how to go about doing this so that we meet rules and regulations and policies, or how we would raise funds to do this. And then maybe not knowing how to set it up and needing some help. But third, no, we don't have a program and we are not interested. So we gave everyone the opportunity to define for themselves where they were in the process. But then Hurricane Harvey happened. And it really, I think, changed for everyone, not only the emergency aid network, but for every institution, how they defined emergencies, the scope of the emergencies for our students, and the ramification, even many, many, many miles from where the actual emergency took place, because our students might have permanent addresses within that area. So you can see before you a map that shows the impacted area from Hurricane Harvey. If you see the lighter yellow band on the far south and west side, my home from Rockport, destroyed in that zone, in the orange zone, but in the yellow is where my campus is located. And so we did have students who, when we went through permanent addresses of the 9,300 students at Texas A&M University, for example, 3,000 of our students had addresses in this location, somewhere within these bands. But remember, when I said so many institutions indicated that they did not have emergency programs, 1/3 of the institutions located in this area did not have emergency aid programs in place. So today, we get an opportunity to inform you, but also to ask for your help, your opinions, your suggestions. That's one of the things that's most important to us. We provided a handout to you, and we're going to ask you to answer some questions that the Emergency Aid Network individuals have also been asked. One of the things that I want to focus on here is that we understand that there are rules of professional judgment that are exercised. We understand how each institution is very carefully considering how to calculate cost of attendance, your averages in housing, food, books purchased from the bookstore, your miscellaneous expenses. But the truth is that there are many things that, even though we, I think, broadly define miscellaneous or transportation, are still not included within your cost of attendance. We also understand that even if students did receive financial aid, an emergency might come where no aid was provided, where they were going to have to pay out of pocket, and they truly cannot do so. So one other point that we'll make, besides emergency grant aid or loan aid, is also the fact that most institutions, either in light of Hurricane Harvey or prior to it, were stepping up with other aid programs. So one thing that we learned was that the majority of our institutions did have food pantries, either access to one within the local communities or at their own universities. We actually have a food and hygiene pantry on the campus in the Student Union Building at Texas A&M University, Kingsville, that when Monique sent her survey did not exist. And that was in the summer. But within days of Hurricane Harvey, existed, was set up, had an intern from the dietetics program working there, had food on every shelf, because our communities come together in that way. When we had our opening faculty and staff meeting, the price of entrance, which was normally free and expected for you to attend, was canned food or hygiene products. And we were overwhelmed by the amazing support and response of our faculty and staff members who came to that meeting. I highly suggest thinking of some creative ways to make that a part of your everyday process and thought. But we also have a school supply pantry where you might have extra binders in your office. You had them for some event and you realize you're not going to use them, and you donate those binders. We have Scantrons. We have pens and pencils and notebooks and even backpacks that have been donated by people within our organization or within our community for a school supply pantry for students who truly, although awarded some aid, may not be able to afford those things. We also have a clothing closet, and many of you, I think, in conjunction with your career services departments, have professional clothing closets. These could be closets where people have donated really nice professional clothing that they can't fit anymore, or that they just, it's just not something that they're going to wear. They received it as a gift, or that we've received money, fundraising kinds of donations, and we've actually gone out and purchased brand new suits, ties, shoes, pantyhose unopened, those kinds of things that are in a clothing closet. We also know that we have everything from free or scholarship housing in the event of emergencies. We had a major event happen at a local apartment building, and we allowed students to move onto campus and provided them housing scholarships for a portion of a semester. If you have housing, or you even have local apartments that will do housing aid programs, those are excellent to include in your emergency aid program. Notifications to students are on your websites. We also have a tremendous number of partnerships that have been created. One is with Goodwill. They will provide coupons for your students to use to receive discounts when going there, especially if they've had emergencies. They'll even do a deeper discount on any items for a student if they're replacing things in their apartments or clothing, something like that. So this is really limitless. And it's open to the imagination and the contributions of your communities. So we just wanted to be really clear. We've got transportation services in some communities, but not in others. We have a number of opportunities, I think, for you to partner and for your students to benefit. So with that said, I'm going to turn it back over to Monique to facilitate the actual questions that we have been receiving as EANet members and asking for some input from you.
Thanks, Dr. Riley. I also want to say that even though Texas A&M Kingsville did not have the program that they have today, or a named program even, they did answer the survey according to the needs specified by the grant of what they were providing to students. So I would like to ask your opinion or your input on the questions put before you in the handout for the frequently asked questions regarding emergency aid practices. And if anyone has any suggestions there, or notes that I could take, I'd appreciate it. Let's give you a few moments to look that over. These are probably basic things that you come across today in your own programs on your campus. I know that not all the emergency aid programs are run through the financial aid office, but I'm sure that you're familiar with it on your campuses. Like I said, 4 of our EANet teams are represented here on the committee today.
While my colleagues go through and look at this, I do have a quick question.
Yes.
On the beginning of the presentation, you had the quote about 3 million students having
Nationwide.
issues. Do you have the data source for that?
That came from the grant from the Gates Foundation, so that's a national number.
Okay. Do you know where they got that number from?
I do not, but I can find out.
Okay, that would be great. Thank you.
No, I think I'm also curious to see if, for those of you that do have emergency aid, are you counting that as a resource? You are? Okay. Do you have like a threshold or?
During Hurricane Harvey, we had a lot of request students in need of emergency aid, and so we went to the regulations, and the department sent out regulations on what needs to be counted, and I think it was, the threshold was like $25. It was really small. Do you remember, Delisa? I know we talked about that.
I don't remember. We did have some conflicting guidance from the Department of Education on whether you should or should not. In the first part that came out said that you, if it was for non-educational expenses, that you didn't have to count it. Then I got a follow-up on that, and they said that that was not true, that you would have to count the emergency aid no matter what. But I don't remember a threshold. So I know for us, I mean, we did have a couple of different ways that students were getting assistance, and we were counting it. But what we did is work with some of those students to do adjustments, professional judgment adjustments to their cost of attendance for things that could have been educationally related due to the flood. So, for instance, maybe they lost their computer and all their books and supplies. And so we're like, okay, well, we can document that and then increase the cost, for you to repurchase a computer or books and supplies or something to that extent.
Yes.
And our normal use of funds, because we have a couple different ways we can help students. So we do have short-term loans, but we also have a student assistance fund. The student assistance fund is more like free money. And we do work with our student affairs office, and we do count that. But then again, we always see, they check with us. Does the student have any unmet need? If they get this money, how will it affect their financial aid? And then are there any type of extenuating circumstances where we could increase cost of attendance, where it wouldn't negatively impact aid they've already received? So, and that's going to vary from student to student and case by case.
Right, and also the Harvey created the disaster aid, right? So disaster aid is a separate monster completely from emergency aid. So there are rules and statutes surrounding the disaster aid. We found those, but it's the regular emergency aid, So things that, and it kind of goes back to what is included in your institution's cost of attendance. How deep do you dive into those costs? What the categories are. So I was speaking with Chad about regular transportation costs. A dead battery or a flat tire is not usually included in those maintenance or regular transportation costs on the cost of attendance. So, you could look at it that way. And sometimes it is, easier or better to do it through a professional debt judgment if you have documentation and maybe it, is an extenuating circumstance that way. But it also goes back to how you define what is an emergency on your campus. And that's what we're finding out in the EANet, how important that is, that definition, but also the cost of attendance, definition, what is included or excluded in each category. And you want to, yes.
I thought I would share that when we set up our emergency aid grant program, we did it through our foundation, and we had the pleasure of hosting Raul Galvan from the Department of Education at our campus on the day that we had our meeting to form the emergency grant aid program. I asked him, I know you're here already, meeting in financial aid and doing some training. Will you please join us so that we make sure we dot every I and cross every T with the ways that we hope to create this program? He absolutely was outstanding and helpful. But one of the things that he mentioned was, if defined very broadly, if it is an emergency that your foundation is funding some way, somehow they're giving a check to the student, it really does not have to go through your financial aid office as an external resource. It is not a competitive scholarship program. It is an emergency that is defined by your foundation's board. And so we had to immediately start to fundraise. As I mentioned, we had no money in an emergency grant aid program. It was sort of, we've got to have something in place. And at that point, we also knew that there were other people doing a tremendous amount of fundraising. We have the Harvey Help program, which I probably should have mentioned earlier in the presentation, also doing quite a bit to raise funds and to hopefully help institutions who had whose students had tremendous losses. But in that vein, if under the $600 threshold, the tax accountants that we received advising from indicated that we would not have to produce 1098 for the student for the next year out of our foundation, that would not then take away from future financial aid allocations. We worked with Raul to ensure that that was accurate, and he said that it was, because it was based on emergencies defined by your foundation and not competitive. So in the past year, we had a student whose family lost their business with Hurricane Harvey, and he received $250 in grant aid to replace some clothing that he needed for his internship, but then also received a professional judgment through financial aid and received about $2,000 of additional grant aid. So we were able to help him in a couple of different ways. We had a student who needed to get a job, but did not have money to purchase non-slip shoes and pants. You can imagine he works in a catering or food service kind of an industry and couldn't afford the clothing, and the emergency grant aid program was able to help with that. And so I just wanted to be clear that we're not taking our emergency grants in that way through our financial aid program, and that we did receive assurance from the Department of Education representative that that was acceptable as a model. So if you have questions about that, I would highly recommend contacting those resources and making sure that they've reviewed any of the policies and procedures to receive some guidance from them.
And at Texas State, we pretty much follow what A&M does, and I think if we have that in writing, that would help us a lot, because we don't want to make things more difficult on the students. But I think the regulations, and both in terms of the Federal Student Aid Handbook, are pretty clear that if a student is getting an aid, regardless of whether it's competitively awarded as a scholarship or it's a grant, we as financial aid offices really need to know about that to make the determination whether it can count as a resource. And I think the intent there from the federal government is to make sure students aren't getting more federal aid than they should under the regulations, but also to make sure students are coming to the financial aid office so we can really assess their needs, and is there anything we can do from a federal or state or institutional perspective to help them out. But that would help me in writing, because I think we all deal with the auditors on an annual basis, and that's very specific in the regulations in the handbook that we need to know about it to count that type of aid as a resource. And so I think auditors would question that when they come to our campus every year, but if we were to have that citation in writing, that would help us in terms of the auditors, but the auditors hone in on that every single year.
And I just wanted to add that we're in partnership with Trellis and the Department of Education for an emergency grant program. And just like you said, it's not routed through financial aid because they didn't want us to have to worry about their cost of attendance. But the distinction is that if there is an emergency, like for a car or paying their rent, that we're going to send those funds directly to that organization rather than give it to the student.
Right, they have a third-party process. We're also in partnership with Trellis, and so that's their requirement and how that's managed. So I agree with you in terms of the citations and our work with Raul Galvan. I should mention that one of the members of the committee that makes these decisions on the emergency grants, because our goal is that when a student submits an application through our online process, that the student, if awarded, has money in his or her hands within 24 hours. Again, it's an emergency. You need the money now, not next week, not next month. And so we have a financial aid. The Assistant Director of Financial Aid is not only part of our EANet group, but also a part of that committee that makes those decisions, so that they are also taking that into consideration. So that's another great model to use.
And I think, too, another important reason is we get this clarified is because we never want to be in a situation where a financial aid office does not know that a student is receiving aid. We find about it after the fact and force a student much later on into a situation where they have to make a repayment and really compound a situation where the student's in a bad situation, and we're making it even worse by not making sure we have transparency and communication, which I think is the intent of the Department of Education with respect to all aid that a student receives, if that aid is awarded based on their, at least in part, based on their enrollment in a post-secondary education.
Agreed. We would not want that to. We would not want an over-award situation to be forced either, and that's why we're partnering. I also wanted to mention foundations. I've mentioned mine. We're very blessed to have an incredibly supportive foundation board. We also received a very nice donation from our Economic Development Council at the start of our program. They donated about $8,000 just to get us kickstarted, which was great. But some of the institutions in Texas do not have foundations. And one of the things that we have heard through our EANet program, as well as through the Department of Education, is that many community foundations would also be willing to partner with your organization to set up such a fundraising arm and awarding system. Of course, they're not usually mechanisms of a 24-hour turnaround of a payment. However, they may be willing to partner with the organization in some way. They're already doing scholarships for some of your students, probably, or for organizations, and it's an external resource for your students. If you do not have a foundation, we strongly encourage for you to work with a community foundation if you have interest in that.
Are there
Any
any
other questions?
I do have a few questions. So is this in the future, are there going to be other institutions that can participate in the EAE, or is it just
EANet?
this group?
The 10 institutions that are in it right now are the original members. We're hoping that this goes even further after this grant ends in October. We hope that it there is maybe established an online bank of information where if you don't have a program, how do you get started? Or maybe you do and you need to vamp it up to be more flexible and more efficient. I know that NASPA is working on a site called the Student Arc, where administrators and others can add information to that site, so it'll be like a one-stop shop for helping not only students but also, institutions in getting their program going or, making it better. But as far as other institutions, that's what we're having the convening for, is to invite everybody and let them have an input in what we put forth as our final recommendations. And I hope you all come. It's going to be in September here in Austin, and September 10th and 11th. And the first day will be for your presidents and your chancellors, but everybody's welcome to come. The second day will be for the administrators, and then we'll also have nonprofit organizations, community-based organizations there to show how they are willing to partner with your institutions for the services that they already provide, because that's one thing that we're finding out. It's not just the aid alone. That's obviously a help, but, we need to dig down and find the root of the problem, and sometimes those things can be handled with support services that are already out there and doing it well. UTEP is bringing in social work students, graduate students, to come in and peer mentor their students, and that seems to be a very successful program so far. And they're going to continue that as long as, they see good results.
And Monique, this is Chris again from Texas State. My last comment, I think what y'all are doing is great, and I think it's wonderful. And I think if you are able to get that citation and guidance from the Department of Education, that would relieve us of that burden of coordinating all that type of aid. If you could distribute that statewide as quickly as possible to all the institutions, because I would love to take that to an honor and say, no, we don't have to do that. So I think that would be wonderful. So
Yes.
thank you for what you're doing.
at the, let's see, we can probably show that here, that our website that shows all of our information of what we've been doing so far, recommendations as far as other schools and what they're doing is all available on the website, as well as the webinar that we did for Harvey, for the Harvey Help Fund. All that information and the videos are all on this website. So I'm hoping to put this information, this frequently asked sheet up there with, and I want it to be filled in, not blank as it is now. You know, we're finding out that there's a lot more out there what we can't do versus what we can do around emergency aid. So I hope that that changes.
Selma?
Yes.
I have to throw in one comment that'll be a little bit different, I think, and I just have to play the devil's advocate a little bit in this. I think things like this are fabulous, but these are programs and reactions that we as a community come up with in response to things that are outside the norm, things that just, there's no way you can account for all of this in the regulations and everything. And I think this is a perfect example. And just know I've been doing this for a long time, so I've been through lots of disasters, lots of different things. And I kind of feel like this is one of the examples of when less guidance is better. And I think we need to know basic groundwork for these things, and I agree with that. But, and I've heard the department say this repeatedly over the years of stop asking us so many questions. So if we push these types of things too far, what we end up getting are regulations we didn't intend that hamper our ability to actually operate outside of the norm, which is what these are. So I agree, if there's guidance out there, we want to know what it is. We need to make, we have a fiduciary responsibility to do the best we can within the regulations, but I would caution that pushing the feds too far for regulations, you sometimes end up with answers they don't even want to give us.
Right, be careful what you ask for, kind of thing.
Well,
and again, I want to say that disaster aid, these things that, you know, occur very rarely, that's totally separate. So emergency aid, and maybe we need to think about not calling it emergency, because we come to find out that the way students look at an emergency may not be what it actually is. So like, you know, I've got a dead battery. Well, I've got to use the money that I was going to pay for a book now to go buy a new tire or a new battery or a new tire or whatever. I had to fly home for a funeral. Now that money that I was going to pay for that class is gone. So getting to the root of the problem, and these things do happen on a daily basis every day.
We see, you know, it always amazes me. I'm at a school that has a $65,000 cost of attendance, and you see a kid who's stuck owing a couple $100,
right?
Which seems like such a small amount in the big picture. And then when you meet with them, you realize they have literally hit the wall. They have done everything they possibly can. They've exhausted every option out there, and it's down to a couple $100 of a $65,000 cost of attendance, and they're stuck. And that always amazes me how many of those there are.
Yeah, and that's where technology is going to come in. I'm hoping that's one of the things that we're studying too, is that predictive analytics, where we can, you know, look at things that maybe a student may be more prone to not being able to have that money at the very last semester before they graduate. Predictive analytics, you know, new software like chatbots and things like that. Georgia State's using a Admit Hub, and we're going to be talking about that in our next meeting in April. Tim Rennick's going to be talking about all the technology that they're bringing into Georgia State. So I'm really excited about that. But you know, like you said, sometimes you don't, you know, you see these students, it's minor. It's usually under $1,000. And most of the time under. The survey showed that it was like around $50 to $150 on the majority of aid given to students.
And I said this the last time I was going to talk, so I apologize. I lied. But I agree. We don't want to ask the Department of Education for any more information than we want, because we don't want to get boxed in. But in this situation, I think the regulations are pretty clear. And I know in terms of the auditors coming to my office, they make it pretty clear what their expectations are. So I think our asking is to make sure that perhaps we can get relief from what is very explicit in the regulations and really allow us to better help the students through this program. And I think getting that clarification will really help maybe minimize some of the regulatory intent and allow us to better help students through the emergency aid program. But clearly when auditors come into my shop every year, they're expecting me to know any type of aid a student is receiving that's based on their enrollment in a post-secondary education institution and that are defraying some of their educational costs. So they're expecting that I'm coordinating that so students aren't getting more aid than necessary. Now, a lot of these situations, as you described, we can simply do a professional judgment. If they come into us, we can also make additional aid available to them and adjust it so there's no net negative effect upon the student. They can receive the aid they need, but the expectation of the federal government, to me, is fairly burdensome. We have to know and process all that so we can demonstrate every year to the auditors that we're in compliance. So I think it is worth asking the Department of Education so we aren't as restricted. At least some of us, I think, are restricted in terms of what we've gotten from guidance previously from the Department of Education, as explicit as the regulations are, and what the auditors come to our shops every year and expect us to be able to demonstrate.
I think maybe the distinction is what were the source of the funds. So institutional, if I'm Texas A&M, I'm supposed to know what entities on my campus as an institution are giving funds to students, and I'm to account for that. So the guidance might have been because if it's the foundation, it's not considered Texas A&M proper if I'm going with our foundation. However, then I think this responsibility shifts to the student really to report if they received additional funding. So that might have been where that guidance came from. The issue I think that we get involved with is if the financial aid office possibly plays a role in any way, then we somewhat know the information, and should we act on that? So that may be a little bit of that difference.
Yeah, I think there's definitely that administrative capabilities was in a different section of the regulations that make sure you know everything that's going on your campus. But you're right, too. The student is supposed to report to us all the resources they're receiving to help defray their costs. I think most institutions ask that question of the students before they can even accept and periodically process aid for them. But I think that gets into a whole other set of the regulations. The part that deals with estimated financial assistance doesn't differentiate between institutional aid or aid coming from a foundation or from another private source. It's all supposed to be counted. So I think, again, going to the department, asking for that clarification could possibly take a burden off of us, but more importantly, take that burden off the student.
Right. Educational benefits is very broad. In the definition of estimated financial assistance, that number 3 bullet point there is any educational benefits. So that's, again, it goes back to your definition and your cost of attendance, and also in your definition of emergency.
So did we help answer the questions that you have on here, or
what's that?
Did we help answering the questions?
Yes, and a lot of it is getting that written citation. That will be a big help. Did you have anything to add?
If they wanted to share with you, if they have other responses to the other.
Yes, if you go back to your campuses, or if you have anything to share, again, my information is on the website, and I appreciate your comments, emails. Like I said, we're going forth with our convening in September, and we hope to see representation from all your schools and your organizations there. And thank you for allowing us this time today. I appreciate it. And thank you so much. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Okay, we are ready to move on to Agenda E, Agenda E, update SB 0887 loan letter, Ginger Gossman. And is this the other presenter? Is that who's going to be on the phone?
We were hoping she'd be able to call in, but the phone gods are not with us today, and she is not able to call in.
Okay.
But thank you for asking. So yes, I am here to give you an update on SB 887, the student debt letter that was became statute last session. As you know, well, I'm not sure all of you know. It looks like there are some new faces here. So we sent an early draft of the rules for SB 887 to the Financial Aid Advisory Committee on January 8th, and I did get some comments back from some of your members, or some of you, so thank you for your time. We really appreciate that you looked at that advanced copy. It was a very advanced copy. And it went through several facelifts after that. The rules, as they stand now, were posted on the Texas Register on February 16th. They will remain posted until March 18th. I have not received any comments I've not received any formal comments. So please take a look at those, share with your campuses or your colleagues, and if you would like for us to consider any of your feedback, they will need to be submitted formally, which would be through my email. Just a huge thanks to the internal staff at Coordinating Board who helped finalize those rules, because it took a team of 8 internally, plus all of your comments and feedback to make this happen. If we do not receive any comments through the Texas Register process, these will go to our Committee on Affordability, Accountability, and Planning. We call it our CAP committee on March 21st. And unless the committee has any burning questions about the rules, they will likely be adopted and taken to our full board in April. So again, if you have comments, please just share them through email with me. The other piece I wanted to discuss today is the optional template for the student debt letters. So this is something that we've talked about in a previous sharing out when I've given you an update on the 887. You asked if a template would be available, and I said, sure, we'll work on that for you. So we did come up with something. It's very much modeled after the Indiana letter. One of my colleagues, Holly Koshevich, has been working on this. So what we shared with you earlier this week is indeed a draft with some comments that we'd like to consider internally, but also some of those comments include questions for you and whether or not you think we need to bolster this letter with additional definitions. For example, the definition between a subsidized and an unsubsidized loan. Are there any state loan programs you think we should delineate when we're giving the estimated total for state loans? Really just, are there any pieces that you think need more information for your students for you to feel like you are giving your students the full picture of their indebtedness? So again, if you want to share something now, that's perfectly fine, but also you have my email to share with me that way as well. Because this will be an optional letter. It will be something we share with it. We'll make it publicly available and basically state this is for something for you to use as a campus if you choose to use it, or you can develop your own.
I think that doing a brief about subsidized versus unsubsidized is always helpful to remind students the difference between the two. You know, just for explanation purposes when they're looking at that.
So as you asked earlier, if someone would be calling in, she was not able to, but Christy Vien, she's the Assistant Vice President for Student Affairs, and her colleagues have been working on a student debt letter that they've drafted for Sam Houston State. And we actually reviewed that letter and gave them feedback to make sure that the template they were working on aligned with the statute and with the rules. So if you decide to build a letter internally, we'll be happy to review that for you.
Right, again, Ginger, I like the letter a lot. It looks really good. I'm not sure you're looking for this type of input, but we started a similar letter several years ago at Texas State University, and one thing we realized from our focus groups with students is that the information, when it's presented in a table, it really pops out of them more and they have a better understanding of it. So that would be a very minor suggestion, but perhaps when you talk about repayment amounts, total principal, total amount repaid, including interest, it might be good to put that in a table just to make sure that information is more effectively imparted to students. At least that was the feedback we got on our campus from students.
So you're talking about just sort of one brief table that lists all of the indebtedness?
Correct.
Yeah, okay.
Ginger, it's Jeannie. I agree with what Chris is saying. Where you have the little table here already that says federal, state, and then private, if you could just move some, instead of outlining each of these different loans and the amounts, if you could just put it all in this table, I think that would be really helpful.
And Ginger, I don't know if this was covered or not, but is this going to be available to send out electronically?
The statute requires that the letters be sent electronically.
Oh, okay, I missed that. Okay, thank you.
So yes, we'll post this as a Word document so that you can take it and modify it as you see fit. So for example, we can try to create a table, or it might be easier for you to just cut and paste what you think should go into a table for your campuses and modify it that way. But we'll take a crack at it as well.
One of the things that one of our staff members brought up was that in terms of sample repayments, there maybe could be an asterisk that says other repayment options may be available, only because we deal with medical students who may have $200,000 worth of debt, and seeing that payment might put them give them a coronary, I think, in some instances. But that was the reason he thought that might be maybe just a good asterisk.
Other repayment options may be available.
Right, instead of just showing one. I mean, I know that's the standard, and that's what's going to happen if they don't choose something else, so that's definite, very important to show it that way.
Right.
But just to, maybe so they'll read it and not freak out.
Okay, sure.
So if we have additional comments, you said we can email you, is that
Certainly.
correct?
Mhm.
Okay, so I'd like to look at it a little bit more.
Ginger, I had, to admit, I haven't read the rules that are in the registry yet, but I did comment on the draft that you had sent regarding private loans. If I remember correctly, the statute really didn't address that we had to include anything about private loans, and I am fine with including stuff in private loans, but every time I visit with the lenders that come into my office and they show me the loan volume that they have for my institution, I'm always kind of shocked because the number of non-certified school loans that are happening that I have no awareness of, really, a lot of times is out there. So I'm very concerned about that private loan component being in there when it's really not part of the statute, and it had even made its ways into the rules, which really concerned me as well. Can you address why the rule at the time, and it may have been taken out, addressed private loans when the statute really only addressed federal and state loans?
So our understanding of the spirit of the law is that it really wants to provide a student with the most full picture of indebtedness that is available to us. What information is available to us, by us I really mean you, what information is available to you that you can share with the student? So if you are not aware of a private loan, because the statute, the way it reads is that we're asking you to share data about loans that is reasonably available to you. So what data is reasonably available? If private loan data is reasonably available to you, the expectation is that that information would be shared with students. If that data is not reasonably available to you, as you just said, you don't always know what the market share is of private loans on your campuses, then we do not expect you to share that with students. We just ask that you explain that in the letter. Like, we may not know all of the loans that you have. We can only share with you what we know. And so that was the spirit of the statute from the beginning, and while it may not be explicit in the law, that is the expectation. But if you have a comment about the rules and you don't like that, please send me an email. Yes, yes.
And Ginger, my only comment on the rules was I didn't really have any comment on it because I think it was taken very well, almost verbatim sometimes from the actual statutes. I think it was very clear, very straightforward. So you may not get some comments from the fact that I think most people wouldn't have a lot to critique about it. So it might be good if we have read it and we don't have a suggested improvement, that perhaps as a committee we just communicate that to Ginger.
And I think for most of us, it's implementing it and how to get the letter out with the data that we need. So I was going to ask the group, are you actually going to pull data, student data, into this letter? And how do you come up with like the interest, since there's so many different types of interest with loans? And I see some heads and others looking like, I think that's what I'm hearing from other schools too. You know, it's one thing, the letter looks great, but it's how are we going to implement and put that data into the letter? Or do we have an option to have a generic letter and to have students go out to our portal where they have information there?
I do not think a generic letter would satisfy the law.
Okay.
If you would like, we can, and we've talked about this earlier too, but we haven't made any movement in this regard, but would a webinar of some kind to help to provide a forum for you to talk with one another about what implementation practices are effective for communicating with students in this way, or how to do the right data pull? Because I know we've heard some from the field that people are still confused about that piece, like what data should we use and how do we do it?
I think that would be a great idea. And I mean, some of us are already doing it to kind of share those practices and maybe how we have to refine what we're doing. And to follow up on Zelma's question, Ginger, so when we send out letters to students now, we're basing it, and we're very clear to the students, based on a certain percentage rate. And we understand, depending upon the T-bill when it's sold, what those interest rate will be at the time a student borrowed a particular loan. It's very difficult to follow them over time and give them a weighted average of what that interest rate will be on their portfolio of subsidized and unsubsidized student loans. Is it okay from your perspective, with respect to the intended legislation, that we simply put the repayment amount and give them the percentage on which it's based, which may be an average of all students?
I think if you are explaining how and why you're doing that, because the letter is supposed to explain the limitations of the information that is shared, and if that under that limitations section you say, we're basing this on an average because we can't follow you individually over time, or something more succinct than that. But
Sure.
as long as you explain how and why, I believe that certainly satisfies the law.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is that a webinar is welcomed. As a committee, is there any other ideas of how to pull this together or help institutions that have questions?
Selma,
Yes, Jenny?
outsource. That's our,
Outsource?
yeah.
There are quite a few services available. One of them was it Great Lakes?
Yeah, that's who we're going with, Great Lakes.
And unfortunately, I'm not, we can't advocate for any service over the other. I can't even evaluate other services because I'm not at an institution. A lot of them don't really want to let me inside to see what they don't want me to see their product because I'm not I'm not a potential customer. So I hope that if you are outsourcing and you're satisfied with that product, that you share that with your colleagues.
I think we just kind of planned to ensure we meet the letter of the law, but we're doing something within our portal from the ICER data. And we were letting them know that, we can only provide what we know. So, and we used to do the letters annually already, but with a school my size, that gets costly every year because it's 30,000 letters or so forth. But we always, kind of gave the information in the letter such that, it may not be an all-inclusive picture of your debt. But this is a starting point, and then we gave other places they could go. Specifically, we've always had a large college access loan volume, and then we know students have, other loans, like Perkins was one, which we could pull in the letter, and all of that, but they might have done alternative loans. So we tried to give them the other places and resources where to go to get all this information. And we were just merely trying to give them what we had and what we can confirm for them at that point in time.
I would suggest maybe using some type of question and answers, because I suspect you're going to receive a lot of contacts from schools. Will this work? Will this work? Can I use this type of interest rate? And as you say yes and no, if you provide that to the community, you may not continue to get duplicates, or we may get best practices from ourselves. Maybe that can be housed where you have the webinar recorded or answers to the webinar. Some site or something where we can get what the rules are, where the template is, what question and answers the community has asked, what advice you've been given, and that way we can kind of troubleshoot it ourselves.
Yeah, I think an FAQ and combined with the best practices was something that will come out of the webinar. That would be that's how I would just try to design it. But I would very much be leaning on those of you who are already succeeding with communicating this information to help others through the process.
Okay, any other questions for Ginger? No.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you. Okay, the next agenda item is Legislative Recommendation Subcommittee. And I'm going to turn it over now to Delisa. She is the subcommittee chair.
Well, good morning again. So we've been working, you have a copy of the document. I'm not going to read through it extensively because you do have the document in front of you, and hopefully you got the materials beforehand and you've gotten to look at it. But just to give you a little history, at the end of last year, in some of what we talked about last year with the subcommittee, with the Financial Aid Advisory Committee, is forming the subcommittee and discussing some of the things we'd like to go forward with and maybe put in front of the coordinating board to hopefully be pushed up through to consider and maybe through the legislation process that'll come up in 2019. So the recommended proposals, as you could see, we talked a number of times about aligning like the satisfactory academic progress criteria that we use already for our federal programs with the Texas Grant Program. For the ease for students particularly, for them and trying to explain sometimes, as you know, when they're going through appeal processes, a GPA for one program versus a GPA for another program. Well, Pell, you have to have this, but for Texas Grant, you have to have this, can be a little bit confusing for them and so forth as we go through the processes. Eliminate confirmation of conviction for offenses involving controlled substances. Rely on what we have on the FAFSA. There's already a question there. And now, to speak to that, I also wanted to put forward, you've been following some of the stuff with HEA, Prosper Act, and FAFSA simplification. I don't know where things will go, but that is one question that has been discussed, as why is it in the FAFSA as well when you're looking at trying to curtail some of the burdens through the FAFSA. So we'll see where that goes, but we still want to put that forward so we could align what's being used on the FAFSA for the Texas Grant Program and so forth as well. TEOG program, which is not particularly my expertise, but I've leaned on some folks to kind of help with that, and so the matching requirement there to kind of align that with what we have for the Texas Grant Program. And if there's community colleges that want to speak to that at all, I welcome your comments to the group. And if you're looking at what we've written thus far from the subcommittee, if you don't think it accurately depicts what, as the community colleges would like, then feel free to speak now or send me an email later. It doesn't matter. And we can certainly refine any of that language. So also aligning Texas Educational Opportunity Grant, TEOG, once again, with college costs. Community colleges are dependent on this grant, to increase their enrollment, so in retention rates. So the discussion there. We also talked about appropriating sufficient funds, the federal job relocation and development. So some of the schools do struggle with very small staffs and trying to implement the regulations for the Texas College Work Study Program. So some challenges that have arose with the off-campus stuff. So that's another item. And then we, going down the list, not reading in debt, but secure authorizations for the coordinating board to administer electronic TASFA application for relevant data submission. In my institution and talking to many other institutions, electronic means for students and parents would be very advantageous. The FAFSA, there's over 90% of students that use that application electronically no matter what. And so I think sometimes the paper and the cumbersome process for student parents in this application does deter some students from completing applications as well and sending them forward. So that was another thing that we proposed there. And then appropriations and authorization to centralize the functions required under SB 887, and that's the student debt letter, the information that we've been discussing, maybe with coordinating board being able to take that and administer and maybe being able to garner additional information, not only from what we report from institutions, but for alternative loans maybe, and working with some of the other functions that may be available. Although, we look at NSLDS, and, I'm always an advocate for the Department of Education to have alternative loans reported to NSLDS, and then we can use NSLDS always to send our students there. If we have state loans and alternative loans there of any kind from private entities, that just makes sense to me to have it all together, but that's just Elisa. And then we're continuing to monitor federal aid programs and what may happen with the Prosper Act, HEA, to see, what might we do at the state level for any of our state programs. We've had some discussions. There is a number of state programs outside of the things you think of. If you think about just the Texas Grant and TEOG, but think about all the waivers and exemptions. Is there another way to accomplish funding students and using those dollars collectively through programs instead of having, 25 different programs, but consolidating down. So we want to continue to think about that, and especially see what happens on the federal side, but maybe we can use some of what we learn and maybe think outside of the box from what we've done, just because we've done it for the sake of some of these other exemptions. Review of timing for appropriations, and then be to early FAFSA, and I know we've been talking about that. The March 15th is still in place, and we've come up with a recommendation for it to be more in the January timeframe. And then lastly, I'm kind of putting something forth for Texas Grant to allow student to, kind of get off the $5,000 target amount, maybe go up to $7,000. The maximum Texas Grant now is close to $9,000. The issue that we see, I think, at schools is as tuition and fees have increased, the $5,000 amount, while it does serve a purpose and we're grateful to have it, may be consideration of increasing that target amount a little bit more in order to help offset more of the cost. So just, you have this information in front of you. You are still welcome to send me some comments. However, we do need to finalize this soon so that it can move forward. So I will open it up now if anybody has any comments, questions, concerns on this document.
One thing I just want to clarify, Delisa, you had made the comment about timing, and you'd said we'd made the recommendation. It has been changed to January 1st already.
Okay.
The board approved it. It's in the rules, effective with the 1920 FAFSA year. January 15th, I think, is the date that we decided, but that is out in the rules now.
Okay, thank you, Chad.
And for the last bullet about increasing the targeted amount to increase from 5,000 to 7,000, is that a recommended amount, the target that the commissioner has recommended it, or is that actually in a statute?
No, that is just a recommendation to put forward, but not anything.
So it doesn't have to be.
This was just kind of the committee and some discussions with a couple of people that were helping with this document.
And I invited John Wyatt to come and sit up here with us so that we can have kind of a conversation, since he is our Director of our External Relations and guru on all things legislative.
And I'll just say, I think this is excellent input for us. And I'll talk about this more in the next agenda item, but we are in the process now of going to our board in April with our draft legislative recommendations. So this is very timely for us to be having this conversation. But honestly, even after April, things change between the spring before a session and the convening of a session in January. So we'll be in a process of refining those recommendations even up to the legislative session. So I'm looking forward to this conversation. And then to follow on regarding the feds, Commissioner and I were actually up in DC, I guess 3 weeks ago, meeting with members of the delegation. We met with the House Higher Education Committee, or I guess the Education and Workforce Committee. I would say the odds of a higher ed reauthorization being passed this session are very low. The House is in a very different place than where the Senate is likely to be. They haven't even introduced a bill yet. And just given the environment, I don't see anything happening this year. So more than likely, they will simply extend the reauthorization as they've been doing for, 6 years now.
John, I have a question about that. I had the opportunity yesterday to speak with Dr. Johnson from the U.S. Department of Ed. He was here for South by Southwest doing a presentation, and he was talking about the Fed's proposed mobile app for doing the FAFSA mobile, and then also having the students have the capacity to look at their complete loan history via the mobile app. And I was just wondering if you had had any opportunity to speak with anyone about the department, from the department about that. I think it will impact significantly some of the things that are going on, especially related to SB 887. I'm just wondering about, at such point in time, when would the implementation of that actually hinder what the feds are trying to do?
I have not, or at least I'm not aware of any conversations we've had specific to that with the Department of Education, but I'm happy to make sure we follow up. I mean, obviously, the goal here is to provide transparency for students, but not to create extra work for no purpose. So making sure that the requirements of the state are aligned with the requirements of the feds makes perfect sense.
Yeah, I just think that's really important. I know that what he was talking about was this idea of transparency. It's a big issue on our campus. We're talking about access, mobility, transparency. I think it's going to be something that's going to come up more and more as we go forward. There were some comments that were made that I found rather surprising, and I don't want to necessarily say that right now, but we can talk a little bit offline. But just along the idea of simplification.
Yep. And I'm happy to talk to you. Yep.
Okay. Are there any questions for Delisa?
Lisa, could you explain bullet number 4? I'm not sure that I understand the bullet, and so I want to make sure I'm understanding it if we have conversations internally about it. The Align Tech TOG with college costs.
I'm going to defer that out to community college, probably call on Brent, because Brent and I worked on some of this. Could you help me with that, Brent?
Bullet 3, I'm very comfortable with.
Okay.
Are they tied together, Delisa? I don't. I just remember the big thing that we had talked about was the fact that we have to match to EOG with something else, TPEG, or if they're receiving some kind of scholarships. I cannot recall exactly where this came from.
Okay.
Sorry.
I wasn't part of the discussion. The only thing I can think of is that the last session, there were some introductions of changing the rules to where it would
And
be-
those are dead.
Well, I know. So I'm just wondering if it has something to do with that.
It could have.
Because we wanted it paired with the Pell Grant and remain strong. But in and of itself, at least, it does serve the purpose of tuition and books,
Okay.
as is paired with the other federal grants is reasonable, I think.
I don't know if that was part of just maybe talking about the matching requirements, Brent. I'm sorry, I don't remember either. I know that we had passed some emails. It has been a while since we had kind of communicated. And Robert, I don't think, did you and I engage in the conversation? Okay. 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 So I can't tell you more about that one at this point. I can revise the document then. So maybe that's an irrelevant point at this nature of the game. There could have been some conversation actually with Alan Ahmad stemming from Harold Whitus back last year as maybe where some of this came from, but I apologize. I cannot remember at this point in time. Okay. But I will revise what I've sent you as a draft, Chad, and send that back up and remove this. Okay?
I just want to make sure that when we talk internally, that I can
Absolutely.
advocate for
I
what you
agree.
guys have discussed.
Absolutely.
All the others, I feel like I could talk about well.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? No? Well, thank you to Lisa and the subcommittee members for working on this document and submitting proposals.
Sorry, I did have one more question.
is that why you
Sorry,
were
yeah, that's why I
hitting
was
me?
touching you. Are these in a priority order? Are they?
I was going to
Did
say.
you have any view?
So where I'm at on this, and Dr. Murr has helped. I know Brent has helped with some of this. Robert, a couple of people. Diane has sent some comments. So, which was my next comment was going to be, I was going to make this revision, and when I sent it back to you, my perspective was going to be that this is final as far as what we wanted to submit forward. I did not and have not put these in any particular order. I just kind of went from our discussions and tried to capture them, and then just kind of look at, based on some of your coaching, which was very helpful, recommended proposals versus the appropriations. So, but no particular order. So when I make the revision in chat and send them back, I would consider that the subcommittee, this is their final. And for those of you who helped me, I know Diane and Dr. Murr, Brent, Robert, unless you disagree with that. And then I do bring to the entire committee, I mean, I know this was subcommittee's work, but if there's anybody in disagreement with that, I think this would be the time to let us know, if you're okay with the document, with that one revision going forward as our final.
So I'm seeing heads nodding that the committee's okay for you to move forward with it.
Just one comment. I think that what the CB tried to do last year with the work study, trying to centralize that, if that's going to go forward again, it might negate the one piece on there. And I would hope that would happen, because hiring a person on
Texas Works over this one?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
Because I think
They're just
hiring a
preempting
person at
my
every
presentation,
campus or helping to fund helping to fund a position that just becomes a costly venture to spend 20% of our dollars. If it could be handled centralized, that would be my vote.
And Alan, speaking to that, and we're aware as the subcommittee, but not knowing what was going to happen and what will happen, which John may have something. I mean, I think we wanted to put it in writing somewhat as a recommendation, just not knowing. Okay.
All right. Well, thank you. I'm going to turn it over to John, and then after that, let's take a 10-minute break. And then at that point, we'll determine if we're going to keep working through or where we're at to see if we're going to have to take a lunch break or not. Okay. So, John, you're over here.
Great. I'm up at the big boy table.
Okay. All right.
Good morning. I'm going to present just a quick overview of where things stand with the legislature, and then where we stand at the coordinating board in developing our recommendations for the next session. We're about 9 months out from the next session. As you know, we just recently had the primary elections, so we're getting more of a sense of who's going to be around for the next session, but there are a lot of question marks over what the legislature is going to look like. Obviously, we're going to have a speaker's race, so we don't know who's going to be the speaker in the House, and the speaker is going to decide who the committee chairmen are going to be. So we might not know that. Potentially, that could be decided in the days just prior to the session, so there'll be some uncertainty on that side. Senator Seliger, who's the chairman of the Senate Higher Education Committee, he did win his primary earlier this week, so we know that he'll be coming back. But again, there's no guarantee with any chairman, frankly, whether they will be reappointed to the position. So there's always that element of uncertainty that we deal with the legislature. In terms of developing our recommendations, as I mentioned, we will be taking the staff recommendations to our board in April. And we have a set of recommendations. Again, we're still vetting these with stakeholders. They are subject to change. But what the board adopts in April will be our recommendations. We do reserve the right to add to them, to amend them as necessary. But that's really going to be kind of our foundation that we will use to then go to legislators and try to push for these as priorities. In terms of what we're recommending on financial aid, some of these are things that you're going to be familiar with. We are bringing back our Texas Works recommendation. So we will be recommending that the legislature create at the coordinating board a centralized place for students for employers to come and offer off-campus work-study opportunities, and for students to connect with those opportunities. So this is something that's very important to the commissioner. We understand the benefits it has for schools due to the administrative burden that y'all face in meeting the off-campus requirement. But we also see this as a way to really invigorate paid internships as a way of helping students afford their education. Some of the advantages that the commissioner sees in paid internships is that it helps students acquire those marketable skills that employers want while they're in higher education. It helps students build connections and networks that are going to help them once they leave. But it's very important that these be paid opportunities because they have to be something that helps all students. An unpaid internship is really only an opportunity for a student who has the means to go without pay. And many of our students don't have that means. So under the Texas Works program, the coordinating board would be the central repository, and we would set the standards for what those internships would have to involve in terms of imparting marketable skills, as well as making sure that there's a reasonable rate of pay that actually helps students afford higher education. The next recommendation we're going to bring back is regarding Texas grants. The only recommendation we're going to make is that the lifetime limit be decreased from 150 hours to 135 hours or 15 beyond degree requirements. As you may recall, last session we had some recommendations regarding limiting the grant amount to tuition fees and books, less Pell. We are not bringing that recommendation forward again. Likewise, for TEOG, our only recommendation is that the program be expanded so that students in community college baccalaureate programs can be funded throughout their studies. Currently, you can only get TEOG for 75 hours.
You can't get it at all if you're a back.
I'm sorry, if you're a baccalaureate student, you can't get it all. So we're trying to create, particularly in light of the legislature expanding the ability of community colleges to offer baccalaureate programs, making sure that there is financial aid available for those students. And then the other recommendations we have regarding financial aid are in regard to the loan program. So we do have a recommendation to increase our bonding authority. Currently, we're limited to $75 million in bonding authority per project. So we go out and we get that authority to issue the $75 million, and then we have to come back if we exceed it. Well, we regularly exceed that $75 million. In the past, it hasn't been an issue because there's been enough room under the state's bond cap, but that space is starting to tighten up. So what we're recommending is that we be authorized to go up to $200 million per bond issuance so that we can meet all of the need for students in the bond program. And then the last recommendation is just some relatively small statute cleanup for the loan program. As constitutional amendments have been passed over the years, authorizing the loan program and expanding it, the statute just hasn't kept up with naming conventions and other things that need some clarity. So we're going to make that recommendation to the legislature. So those are what we're putting on the table right now in terms of financial aid recommendations. Again, I'll be presenting on this at the CAP meeting on March 21st, and then to our board at their April board meeting. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
This may be more a question for Chad, or just to know, based on the end-of-year reports and all the information that institutions submit on Texas Grant, is there any idea as far as in changing from 150 to 130, how many students might lose eligibility? Or have y'all looked at the data that's compiled?
I don't know off the top of my head, what number of students.
By the time we come back from break, I can have an answer for that.
was
Because
just
we did,
curious.
when we did that piece last time round, we did run some numbers as to what that would involve.
And I couldn't, if you did tell us, I'm sorry, I just
It
can't
would have been
remember.
2 years ago, so
Yeah,
I
no,
don't hold it against
I can't
you.
remember sometime tomorrow, so, yesterday or anything, so, thank you. But I'd be curious, I appreciate it.
Sure, and I think there would have to be some element of grandfathering in this. Students who are already at or above 135, you can't say pay back, your Texas grant. But the goal here is to both incent students to complete in a timely manner, but also take that funding that's currently going to those students between 135 and 150 and be able to reallocate that to other students, eligible students.
John, so when we were talking about the TEOG, you mentioned 75 hours, and then Chad was saying, well, it's really about the bachelor's degree. But I want to make sure that we don't have like a snafu in the law that, we would have to have that cap raised from 75 for baccalaureate seeking.
Yes. I believe the goal would be the same eligibility as we're recommending for Texas grant. So that if you're a TEOG student, you would be eligible up to 135 hours for a baccalaureate program.
All right, thank you.
Okay, any other questions for John?
So we're wanting to, real fast, with the Texas grant proposal again, changing the maximum hours, you said to 135?
Or 15 beyond degree requirement. So if you have a 122-hour degree, it would be 137.
As an institution that enrolls a high proportion of transfer students that are coming in with a lot of hours, that may be problematic. And so I would like just to make certain that we don't forget those transfer students, that a lot of them do transfer in a high proportion of hours from our two-year partners and come in. So I hope we do take a look at those.
Well, I think that's a very important point. And, we have issues in the state with transfer that we need to address. One of the things we are also looking at is how can we make transfer more efficient for students to ensure that they're not taking extraneous hours. So we are looking at that. We're also looking at dual credit because what we have is a lot of students maybe taking dual credit courses thinking that how can this be a bad thing for me to take more college credit? But then finding out when they get to campus, well, it's not counting toward a major and it's cutting into the number of hours that you're taking. So these are both big issues. I will tell you that the Senate and the House higher education committees both have interim charges on dual credit. So we can expect over the next, I'd imagine they're going to start relatively soon, but over the next 3-4 months, they will be holding hearings to look into that issue. And then the Senate committee also has a charge specifically to transfer. So impact on financial aid is an element of that we'll have to make sure we focus on.
Okay. No further questions?
I just want to pull back to one just to make sure I'm kind of getting the consensus of the group. I know Alan mentioned it, but I wanted to get a feel of whether everyone agrees with this concept. There's the proposal about being able to use funds to staff a position on campus to do off-campus. We're looking at pushing forward the Texas Works as one of our major recommendations. Are people comfortable with Texas Works being the main thing that we are pushing forward? I just want to make sure that I understand if there's people that feel, no, you shouldn't be pushing Texas Works, that we bring that out now as opposed to in our February meeting or our next March meeting, all of a sudden hearing, why are you guys pushing Texas Works?
For my institution particularly, we're not particularly struggling with doing the off-campus thing because with our federal funds, we're already doing that. So I can speak from that perspective, and there may be other institutions that aren't having the issue as well. But I can't speak for everybody because I know some institutions don't. I think that my concern is, and I know you guys have told us about, people not expending funds that they had. And I was like, wow, I wish we would have got our hands on those funds a long time ago because we could have always used more in the Texas Work Study program and spent that money. And I think relatively, maybe the question on the table is, will we see what we currently get in our Texas Work Study, College Work Study allocations at our institutions decrease because of this?
Well, I'll say the funding component of this is something that we still have to address. So there's the policy recommendation, which is to create in statute the Texas Works program. And then the question is of how you fund it. And that, in terms of what we're going to recommend to the legislature, that's a conversation we're still figuring out. As we develop our legislative appropriations request, that's the venue. We'll be doing that. We've started those conversations. I expect in the next couple of months, we'll be able to say what specifically we're recommending for a funding mechanism. But we had a retreat of our board, and this was a specific issue that they wanted to really kind of hammer out.
And so my question is, are you seeing schools that are opting out of Texas College Work Study because of the off-campus requirement?
Yes, we had over a dozen schools in the first year drop out because they didn't feel that they could fulfill that expectation. I haven't checked the numbers lately, but I know that we did.
Oh, are there other schools here that are participating in Texas College Work Study and have concerns about the administrative burden on your campus? Samantha?
Yeah, at Tarrant County College, we are struggling. So I guess the question is, how much are you going to cut my budget to fund the Works program? Because I like that idea, but if it's going to cut my budget that I had originally before the 20%, then I'll have to compensate. And of course, we're not getting any more federal dollars at this point.
And that was the same sentiment for San Ysidro College. Prior to this, we always have spent our money. So I don't want to run the risk of taking 20% of our budget when we have been spending our money all along. But we do have the challenge of hiring students off campus.
I just think that might be a point to mention. I mean, I understand the premise in how it can help institutions. I think that institutions who've always been able to spend their allocations and who might have been able to use more money at some point is not to lose funding that they currently have. And I don't know exactly how you accomplish that, but that's just, I think, a point that needs to be made and would be a concern.
Thank you.
And I think an important piece to take into consideration as well is the Texas Works. One of the factors of proposing Texas Works is to provide some administrative relief to the institutions. A driving factor is to increase the opportunities available to students to get internships focused on their careers and prepare them. And so I want to make sure that I don't misrepresent Texas Works as being, it's just about making things easier for you. Right. The goal is to create more opportunities for students.
Understood.
Okay, I think that's it, John. Thank you.
Thank you
so much. The time is 11:08. Let's take a 10-minute break or come back about 11:20. Thank you.
I can give an update on the question that Lisa asked.
Okay, you want to do that first?
Yeah.
Okay, the time is 11:21, and we're going to move forward. And if we can get through the next agenda items, we should hopefully be out of here by 12:30, between 12:30 and 1. Okay, so Chad did do some research.
So Delisa had asked about kind of the number of students that would be impacted by dropping the Texas grant cap to the 135 as opposed to the current 150. And based on the FY17 information, currently there's about 1% of all recipients that are even exceeding the 150 cap. Due to like hardship provisions or things like that. Exceeding the 135 cap is about 3% of the overall recipients. It's about 2,400 students across the state that would not be eligible unless there was an appropriate hardship provision or something like that, because there are some of those pieces in there. So it's not a large percentage, but it would allow us to redirect, say, $10 million towards other students, $11 million towards other students. So help basically fund more incoming.
That's helpful. I was just kind of wondering holistically. So thank you for the data.
Yes, thank you. Okay, so now, Chad, you're on.
I'm up.
You're up.
So I wanted to come back to the records retention, because I know that is a question that has been raised, and we want to keep you informed on it. And I did some research since the last meeting to really better understand the individual ideas that internal audit had placed forward as the things that they would like to see occur that would make them feel more comfortable reconsidering the 7-year retention requirement. And as a refresher, those items were more regular student-by-student reconciliation, automated process for making payments, reduction in large end-of-year refunds, and reduction in audit findings that require the scope of the audit to expand. So let me give you a little bit more about each of those. When it comes to the student-by-student reconciliation, there was the question that was asked at the last meeting, a kind of what institutions aren't doing this. And we dug in, I reviewed it a little more detail and realized that it's better described as providing the mechanisms to allow institutions to do monthly student-by-student reconciliation. Right now, there aren't tools in place for you to reconcile against actual THECB data. You can be reconciling internally, but there's nothing that allows you to get information from us to say, here's what we have on file, to be able to reconcile against what you have on file. So it's really more about creating the tools so that you have that, as opposed to a question of people aren't doing it. Which leads right into the next one, which is moving to an automated process for making payments. That is one of the projects that we are specifically looking at right now within our organization, is to create as straightforward process as possible for you to be able to request the information. Sorry, I got distracted. Just so you know, the screen has nothing to do with what I'm talking about at the moment, just so you're aware of that. Sorry, I got all lost for a minute. I'm like, what am I talking about? So the goals, let me tell you about the goals of this automated payment project, and then I'll give you a picture of the structure that we envision. So the goals are to have student-specific supporting documentation for when we release funds to institutions. And that really is coming specifically in as a response to challenges or pieces that have been identified in audits of grant funding, of how we are managing grant funding, is making sure that we have the documentation as to how the funding is being used. Another goal is more timely distribution of funds to institutions. We feel that's going to help you all with what you do, reduces customer inquiry, reduces your customers coming to you with inquiries. Greater efficiency in payment processing, which is going to free up resources internally that we can then dedicate towards more proactive efforts to support you. So as opposed to kind of being in the background just trying to process, trying to be more in the foreground supporting you. Greater accuracy of our performance measures to improve our ongoing reporting. One of the things that we get a question every year from LBB, we report each quarter as to how many Texas grant or other grant recipients there are. So we report the first quarter based on all of the requests for funds that have come in. Then we report the second quarter. The third quarter is based on everything. And then when we report the fourth quarter, there's always this very large drop in terms of the number. And that's because people have gone back and actually figured out who their people are. And the number, if you add up all your requests for funds, where you just say, here's the number of people and here's how much I want, if you add those up and you compare it to what you actually did at the end, we drop several thousand, maybe tens of thousands, between the request for funds form and what you're actually reporting on your end of year and your FADs. And so those numbers that are coming in on those requests for funds have been demonstrated to not have been fully accurate in the process, whereas moving to this automated will allow us to have more accurate. We're looking to alleviate resource constraints that might occur when we hope to start processing summer grants. Improved reconciliation, ongoing reconciliation data for institutions, as well as speeding up the end-of-year reconciliation. We're hoping to reduce institutional reporting requirements. We believe that moving to this new system will allow us to eliminate the first of the 3 FADS submissions, so we could reduce reporting requirements that way. And then internally, we're looking for a platform that's going to have redundancy within the agencies so that that way we have the backup and the support to make sure that we can keep the process moving. The structure that we're envisioning would be a standard file format that would be used by all institutions that would have minimal student data. So we're not talking about another FADS. We're talking about just enough data for us to be able to know who it is you're going to pay these funds on, and to be able to then match it up against something. You know, social security number, first and last name, and the amount. We're talking very minimal. It's not like a Pell XML file or something that we're looking for here. So minimal data. And what you would do would be, any time that you wanted funds, you would submit to us a year-to-date file of all of the people that you have either already dispersed on or that you're requesting funds for disbursement. So you would just keep giving us that year-to-date file that we would then use that, compare it to what you'd already submitted. We would calculate how much money you needed, and we would send that to you. So you would just send us this file. We would do all the processing and be able to, ideally, we were going to have a system that actually kind of zips it through our process as well to reduce the amount of time that it takes us to then get the money back to you. It would build this database from these file submissions to be able to look, we'd be able to see the activity that occurred, but it would also allow you at any time to be able to go in, pull down a file from us of here's what we believe that we have dispersed to you, so that then you could reconcile it against your records, so that way we've got kind of both happening. You're sending us year-to-date that we compare to ours. You can pull down year-to-date. They've also talked about having a portal when you sign in that you could even look to see whether or not your most recent request has been processed, whether the money has been authorized yet, even has the little, I get these USAS ID or something like that, so you can track it, because sometimes we're like, we sent you the money, and you're like, okay, I'll go find it somewhere, because it's like floating through the ether. So giving you the data to be able to see that. It would also have built-in edits, so that when you submitted the file, if there was anything wrong with it, you'd find out right away, as opposed to like you submitting it, waiting for us to be able to see, contacting you, that the file kind of wouldn't be accepted if, say, you had reported Johnny on submissions 1, 2, and 3, and all of a sudden Johnny's missing from 4. It'll tell you, can't accept it because Johnny's missing. Be able to log in. So that's the picture that we have. We're hoping to be able to have this in place by next summer, so not summer of 18, but the summer of 19. It's still working through our internal IT steering committee, et cetera, to verify whether we have all the resources to put that into place. But the initial idea is it would be available for next summer for any institutions that wanted to utilize it for summer awarding, because our goal is to try to have everything in place for summer awarding for next year. And then everybody would have to come onto it for the fall 2019 submissions. So that's what we're trying to do, which would hit at 2 of the major things that the internal audit raised in relation to the current number of years that we require. Before I jump into the other 2, I thought I'd pause, because that was a very large presentation on that, and just see, does that excite people? Does that scare people? Do you think I've led us down a wicked path? Where am I? What's some feedback for me on whether or not we're heading in the right direction?
So Chad, you know, I have a question about this. So the whole concern that I think that we have is that the coordinating board, by going to a 7-year retention records requirement, is now putting us at a de facto 7-year requirement for the feds, which has an impact not only in our office, but admissions, academic advising, faculty, all areas across campus. So when this solution is in place, would that then alleviate the need to have a 7-year and go back either to a 3 like the feds or to a 5?
Internal audit has identified these 4 items that they would like to see happen for them to feel comfortable looking at the potential of making that change. So yes, these are targeted towards being able to do that reconsideration. I can't say if we do this one thing I described, it will automatically be reduced.
But it's one step toward that objective.
But these are definitely all targeted towards trying to create an environment that would allow internal audit to feel more comfortable looking at the suggestion that had come up of trying to better align the records retention with the federal records retention requirements.
And so not to belabor a point, but I noticed when we had visited with the auditors, they had said that it was really a concern at the institutional level too. Now it seems like it's more internal controls, which I understand, but the coordinating board does, when they disperse funds, provide us with a daily registry of those students. And so I would assume most offices across the state are using that data to reconcile against their student aid information system, but also the general accounting office.
When
And
you
if it's-
say a daily registry, what do you mean by a daily registry? Because we don't have student-by-student data, so I don't know how we could provide you with a daily registry.
Well, when y'all send us the coordinating, well, that's embarrassing. So that happened, like, I had a student in my office who was really upset about an appeal denial, and I sat across from him, the same thing happened, so. I feel diminished again because of the chair. But my team gets a roster of those students for whom we're supposed to disperse, for instance, Cal or Be On Time. And at the end of the
Cal and
month-
Be On Time?
Right.
Sorry, that's loan. Grants, you don't send us student-by-student data. You just say, I have 100 students, I have 100 initial students, I need $10,000. I have 50 continuing students, I need $150,000. That's all we have from you right now on grants.
But I thought that was really the concern of the auditors, was not necessarily grant funds, but the loans, because those are the issues that they've been focused on very
It's
heavily
across
last
the
couple of
board. It's
years.
student financial aid programs as a whole.
Okay.
Yes. There's aspects of both that are combined. So it's not just loans.
Okay, I
It's
guess I
the
wasn't clear on
entire
that.
financial aid, because the MOU covers the entire financial aid program. And so their concerns are about financial aid as a whole.
But in terms of issues they've identified across the state, it really has to do with the loan programs, not necessarily the grant programs, correct?
They have concerns about the lack of student reconciliation in the grant programs, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So let me ask.
And I'm sorry, to clarify, that piece didn't come out of the loan audit you're specifically referencing. Yes, there's stuff that came out of the loan audit that you're specifically referencing. There's other audits that have occurred that have raised concerns about other areas, and it's all of those together that is what has brought up the concern.
And I think just to educate the community, it might be nice to have, if the audit group would be willing to come and share that with the Financial Aid Advisory Committee at a later date, because I think that's an important piece that I think some of us may have missed in some of the previous conversations, is the impact on the grant area.
Okay, I will connect with you to make sure I understand what it is that you're looking for beyond what I've already presented.
Okay.
So I think, and maybe this is why, so we've done, I was saying, so with FADS in the past and EOY, so we've reconciled really student to student. But on the funding side, beyond the report where we said, we were like, okay, we have, I'll just pick arbitrary numbers. We have 20 students and it was, $10,000. You said, yes, we showed 20 students, $10,000. But on the funding side though, behind the scenes, there was missing reconciliation. That's possibly that we're
Right, when you
on what was sent.
You reconciled at the end of the year after you had spent all of your money. At that point, you've gone back and said, okay, you gave us $50 million. Here's what we did with it. And what the internal audit has been identifying is, and this relates to how we administer grants in the agency. And so, this is even broader than just, this isn't Texas State in any way, shape, or form. This is in general. We need a better ability to demonstrate how funding that we are dispersing from the agency is being utilized. So as opposed to saying, okay, here's your $50 million, let us know once you're done spending it. We need to know, what are you doing with this money as you're going through this process?
But I guess I'm confused because I was thinking FADS and our end-of-year report, if it was Texas grant money, you knew who.
Right, but that's after the fact. We've already given you all the money, and we just
Correct.
kind of trusted, I hope you're actually spending this in the way you're supposed to be, because we don't know what you're doing with it. This puts more steps into place for us to understand exactly who you're awarding this to, for us to be able to reconcile between your organization and our organization. Like what Chris has described with the loan program, you can pull down a report of all the loans that you've dispersed or that we have on record, and you can compare it to what you have on record. Nothing exists in the grant programs for you to be able to do that, to be able to see, okay, what exactly is going on here. And so this piece, by putting that into place, would be one of the steps that would allow for, as the program occurs throughout the year, there is a stronger monitoring, a stronger reconciliation, a stronger understanding of how the funds are being utilized. And thus, with those additional steps occurring, there's the potential to not feel that we have to have the records retained for as long afterwards, because we would be doing more monitoring as it's occurring, and thus not have to spend as much time after having to go back and check to see whether it was occurring.
And I understand that. I think the point I might want to make then on this, and because you talked about some built-in edits, grant money can be a little bit more fluid because of over awards and other scholarships and stuff when we're going up and down with students. So if, Tom was on the list the first time, but he may not be the second time, but if something changed, and that's an edit, and then we have to figure out like why and do some reporting back to you.
And that's, I think, you're picturing fads. Stop picturing fads.
But you mentioned built-in edits, so that's why I went there.
Well, and what I was meaning was, you awarded Johnny $4,000. You realized it's only supposed to be $2,000. So when you send the next file in, you tell us that it's $2,000 instead. Okay. That's, or if you had to take it away entirely, you reported as zero instead. Okay. So like the edit I was talking about was, you said you awarded Johnny $4,000, and then all of a sudden Johnny doesn't even exist on your file. It's as if he's disappeared from the world. That would be an edit, because we'd be like, well, wait a second, we already gave you $4,000 for Johnny. We can't keep giving you more money if these students are just disappearing. We need to actually know where they're going. So that's what I was talking about from that standpoint. But this is not a, this file has to match with the CBM, and this file has to have all their demographic information, and this file has to have everything about their entire award. This file isn't even going to say, prove to us that there was need. We're not going to ask for cost of attendance or EFCs or anything like that. It's just purely, if we're going to give you money, it is common grant management practice to understand. In fact, there are some programs that we have done currently that we are going to be stopping the process, where we just gave people the money at the beginning of the year and said, tell us at the end of the year how you spent it. That's not good grant practice.
I get what you're saying now. I just wanted to make sure, because obviously we do this with Pell. So, and I'm not against it in any way. I just wanted to clarify on that built-in edit, because there could be that next reporting, that person is a zero.
Yeah, that's fine.
We just couldn't drop him off reporting. We'd have to make sure we reported him as zero. So
Exactly.
That, I was just clarifying.
Yes, exactly. We want to make this as simple as possible. Like, my vision, as I've talked to everyone about it, is we want your software to be able to produce this without you having to manually edit anything. Like, that's how simple we want to get this to. Because I know that there's stuff in fads that you're going and trying to manipulate and figure out how to make it, but we really want it to be that your software can just create this Excel spreadsheet, because it's so simple, that it will do that.
So can you talk again about the timeline? You said this.
What we are currently proposing, it's still going through our IT steering committee and verifying we have the resources, but we're hoping to have this in place for next summer for if people that are interested in utilizing funds for summer grants would be able to use this process, because we're hoping to have summer grants in total put together. There's some rule changes, there's a negotiated rulemaking, there's a bunch of pieces related to summer grants, but this is one of them. So we're hoping for next summer, and then everyone would come on board for 18, 19, 20 is when everyone would come on board with the process.
And I just mentioned that because the earlier schools can know, because they will have to have IT resources to build, and you know that, you're aware of that. So.
That's why we're not trying to do it for this summer. There was actually push internally of let's try to make stuff ready for this summer, and we realized, well, no, we don't have enough internal, and some of the push was me, and people had to sit me down and say, Chad, look at the scope of this project. And I was like, I said that last summer. I know we can't do it now. But yes, the goal is for next summer, but we're going to be analyzing that piece across to figure out all of this. I preface is, I'm mentioning this so that you're aware of what we're looking at and can provide the feedback to move forward. Please don't have me show up a meeting and have someone walk up to me and say, I hear that there's a new report that I have to have ready by next summer and I haven't heard anything about it. Why has that happened? Because there's not anything that they have to have ready by next summer. We're talking about it right now. So, Chris.
So, Chad, thank you. So, I agree with what you're saying, and I think it does make the process a lot more tight in terms of the audit trail, but I would assume most institutions are still doing some type of reconciliation. Sure, it may not be student to student, but it's student, and that student's total worth of aid dispersed compared to what we've asked for withdrawal. So,
right, and that's why I said that when in reviewing this issue in more detail, I was able to determine that the concern was more about not reconciling with agency data as opposed to not reconciling with internal data.
Okay. Yeah, because I think the initial implication that we got was that we as schools were doing something wrong, which necessitated the coordinating board imposing a 7-year retention record. But it sounds, at least on this issue, it's more internal controls that the coordinating board need to be put in place to allow the auditors to have a comfort level with how funds are being managed between.
In partnership with the institutions.
Correct, in collaboration
it's not just us. It's the communication between the two organizations needs to be strengthened.
But they didn't actually find any institutions not doing sort of monthly reconciliations, even absent that data, at least reconciling against the totals dispersed at their institution with that amount drawn from the coordinating board, say, for instance, for the Texas Grant Program.
I can't say that for sure because I didn't go down that level of detail about the individual institutions once I had determined that it was about the reconciliation between the two agencies.
Okay, thank you.
Let me talk about the other two pieces that they would like to see in order for them to feel more comfortable thinking about reducing. One is a reduction in large returns of funds or large unused funds. What I did was I provided you with a handout, and it provides you with all the information about monies that have been refunded over the past, from FY 2012 through FY 2016. So it goes through and it looks at the Texas Grant, the TEG program, and the TEOG program, I believe. I'm not seeing TEO, oh, there it is. And it provides you with the amount of funds that were refunded in February for reallocation, the monies that were returned during the EOY process, and the monies that we returned during the FADS process. And so, you know, on average in the February process, you know, we're looking at, on average, $5 million a year that hasn't been utilized. In the end of year process, we've ranged some years almost $1 million. We had a low of $250,000. And then the FADS process is typically down in the $100,000 area. But I figured I figured that was the best way to give you that answer was, here is exactly what they're talking about. So, and one of the goals in being able to move towards this automated grant processing is to provide you all with a greater amount of time to be able to actually utilize your funds. So as opposed to by February, you have to figure out everybody that's been awarded, provide you through the whole spring semester, potentially the summer as well, to utilize the funds that have been provided to you. And then the final one was a reduction in audit findings that requires the scope of the audit to expand. And they clarified a bit, this one is related specifically to the loan piece, that, the question was asked, well, how often is that happening? This is more about the discovery of the large discrepancies in loan data is still recent enough that there simply hasn't been enough time to pass to verify that this issue is no longer an issue. This is just one of time has to pass, and we see that this is no longer occurring in order to build that comfort level to be able to reduce that. So one of them is just purely time. Got to let time pass and demonstrate that these things aren't happening. And then the reconciliation, the automated process, and the reduction in returned funds, we are hoping that between the negotiated rulemaking to provide more flexibility and the automated processing, that will put pieces into place that really allow the institutions with the flexibility to spend all of the funds that they spend to create more or to free up our resources for us to be able to work with institutions that may be having challenges spending their funds, to work with them to help make sure they understand all the rules, they understand all the ways that they can utilize the funding. I'll admit, I'm always surprised when an institution returns Texas Work-Study funds and they haven't transferred any of it over to their grant program. That just is an unawareness of the rules, especially if that same school has asked for reallocated money. So it's like, okay, you've demonstrated you need more money. You have your own money that you could have used, but you sent it back to us. So we want to be more proactive and help people understand and utilize that. And so automating the process allows us to free up time spent on processing and move that time into training and support. And so that is what we are doing to try to create the environment that will allow us to reconsider.
I can make a comment about that. There's not a lot of good guidance on those deadlines of when those transfers can occur.
Okay.
And
Actually, I'm glad you said that, because one of the things we're looking at is actually putting into the rule a deadline. They mentioned, as we were looking at things for summer grants and things like that,
Like January
one of the
or
things they brought up is to more clearly provide that and to expand the information in the program guidelines to highlight that better.
We couldn't find information about it
Yep.
when we asked to do it, and we were too late.
Currently, it has to occur before the time you have to encumber your funds, so, yep.
Chad, one's a point and then one's a question. And my first point is, I think it's important for the coordinating board, as they're reviewing this and making sure the auditors are their level of comfort is adequate, is that a lot of times at the end of the year, we're returning funds not because of an institutional error or lack of reconciliations, but because we have to, or a student has become ineligible. That could be in a situation where a student has already received their financial aid at the beginning of the academic year, and toward the very end, the federal government has now selected that individual for subsequent selection. So now we have to go through the verification process, and they have a deadline after the academic year to submit their verification documents. If not, we then have to pull their aid at that point in time. Also, too, especially in the recent years, you've had students applying for the subsequent year, and you determine they're now ineligible because they've provided you conflicting information. You then have to pull that aid away from them, and you will see that in the FAD. So I think as the auditors go through, they need to sort of get a comfort level as how much is really due to maybe lack of reconciliation, but also how much are the result of federal requirements being imposed on the institutions.
And that's one of the great things about what we're looking to do, is it helps to try to take out all of the other stuff so that, when it is those unique pieces, it's really clear that it is those unique pieces. But providing the flexibility for you all, to utilize that money and things like that as you do that process. So yes, there are those pieces. Right now, they're so buried in all sorts of other things going on as well. And so trying to clear away that other stuff so that those other pieces become more clear and become more comfortable.
And in terms of institutional errors and the comfort level that the auditors will have with respect to the 7-year retention record, I know when you look at fiscal year 16, in terms of Texas grant, the amount of aid that was returned for that program statewide, both after the end of the fiscal year, but also upon the submission of FADs, was about $68,000. And of course, that doesn't account for students that are subsequently selected or have become ineligible after the fact. But it just, in terms of my math, it comes out to fewer than 0.02% in terms of error. And of course, when you look at fiscal year 14, that jumps up, but the money returned there is less than 0.2%. And so what is that level? I don't think most auditors would consider that a material finding in a different sort of environment. What is their level of comfort? Could we get that information from them just so we sort of understand the goals we have to hit in order to get them to be comfortable with perhaps reducing the 7-year retention records requirement?
When it comes to that specific request, Chris, even if the number was $10, given the lack of other controls, the auditors would still have concerns. So it's, the fact that there's not this understanding of how the money is being utilized, that's being sent out to the institutions, et cetera. So anything I gave you, I want to make sure is not misinterpreted as, oh, we just have to hit that number. Doesn't matter what else we do, as long as we hit that number, we're good. Because that's not what it's about. It's about the lack of controls within the system that really need to be created.
No, I understand that. And my point was in the context of this discussion, which is a number of changes that have to be made in collaboration with the coordinating board, and then really identifying if the auditors, what is that threshold that they would like to meet going forward if all of these improvements and enhancements are actually put into place. I think that would just help us sort of understanding the goals we have to meet and the scrutiny that we'll be under and what we'll need to do in terms of making sure we're reconciling, helping the coordinating board identify situations where not really institutional errors, there are federal imposed requirements where they have pulled back aid after the fact. How do we communicate that at coordinating board so we can get into a position with the coordinating board and working with them so we have a lower records retention requirement and we eliminate, I think at this point, at least on the federal perspective, the unnecessary exposure we have for audit compliance purposes.
All right, thank you. That was a good discussion, and thank you, Chad. So that is an enhancement of the tool to me. I mean, that sounds like a good thing for us. So, okay. All right. The next agenda item is I, which is the data collection subcommittee. And I don't know if we have officially announced that Doris has retired, so she's no longer on this committee, and she was the subcommittee chair for the data collection, and we're going to miss her. She was very instrumental as the chair along with the other subcommittee members. But at this time, we are looking for a new subcommittee chair to replace Doris. The chair works closely with Deshae, and they work together on agenda items. They set the date of the meetings. They facilitate the meetings. The meetings have been held here at the coordinating board as well through phone conference. The last time they met was April 2017. And I'm looking at Deshae because I'm going to ask her to come up here and give a little bit more information about the subcommittee and the role of the chair. And then after that, I am going to ask for a volunteer. Deshae?
Good morning, afternoon. I just wanted to talk a little bit about the data collection subcommittee. As you know, we worked together to pull that wonderful 2017-18 FAD report that you all are doing right now, right? Woohoo, right? I still have friends here. So really, the group is very instrumental into understanding how it works within your institution. It gives some great guidance for the coordinating board in order to make some great recommendations on data elements, description. Of course, a lot of us are still working through the 17-18 first cycle for the report, and we want to improve the instruction manual for the next reporting cycle. And so I think it's very instrumental to have this group pull itself back together and have a chairperson, because here at the coordinating board, we can assume a description, but when you get back to your institution trying to pull that data out of your system, based upon the way it was written, it may be more difficult. And so that's why it's helpful to have someone from the institution and a part of this group who can help the coordinating board make certain that the guidance that's being offered and anything that we do that's related to data is also being seen and looked at from the institution's perspective too. And we can come together and make a consensus. And so I was talking to Zelma just a few minutes ago, letting her know that it would be wonderful to have this group come back together well before it was time for the reporting cycle of 2, which opens on May 1st. So we can go ahead and make sure that the instruction manual that we're wanting to update and the descriptions are much clearer, that everyone has an opportunity to look at that and provide that feedback before we give it back out to the financial aid community. And so I'm really hopeful that the next chairperson that volunteers, one of you all volunteer, we can work really great together so we can make certain that going forward, especially for this being the very first time that we've done FADs 3 times a year, that we can make the information for the next 2 reporting cycles a little more easier for institutions to understand as they're trying to pull that data out for these next 2 reporting cycles.
So do we have a volunteer?
I'll volunteer.
Hey, okay, Dana. So I'm going to ask the committee members, unless there's someone else that wants to volunteer, are y'all okay with Dana being the subcommittee? Yes, yes. Yes. Okay. Well, thank you, Dana. Right.
You'll have lots of fun, Dana.
Okay. Alan, did you have a question?
Just while Deshay is up here, is it appropriate to ask what percentage of FADs have been submitted?
I was actually going to mention that in the SFAP
All right,
update, but
super.
we'll go ahead and why don't you give them the numbers now? Or do you have them, or do you want me to read
In my head.
Okay.
Because I live and breathe FADs every day, guys, so don't worry, I'm there with you. As of yesterday, it was 40% of the institutions had validated for reporting cycle 1. So that's equivalent to about 59 institutions had validated. We had about 85 who were still working out some errors, and 1 institution who was still just trying to get a program and submit it.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
So good. That was a good question, Alan, because I think I'm hearing that it makes some of us feel better that we know we're not alone.
Well, and one of the things that I've mentioned to Deshay, and I mentioned to Zelma earlier, was I think that the approach that was taken and what Deshay has done, and with lots of help from Tanya as well, of doing this with the February submission, to have everyone have the opportunity to work through it and get things solved, has been a great approach. Because if people had faced these challenges trying to do the June submission, which is the equivalent of end of year, or even just the December submission, that would have really caused problems with the program. In terms of our ability to report, in terms of our ability to disperse funds, et cetera. Whereas Deshay has been able to work with schools and help them through the process here without having detrimental impacts on the program as a whole. So I applaud Deshay and everyone that's been helping Deshay on really helping people through this so that by the time you get to your June submission, it's a much more straightforward process.
Thank you. I mean, I don't know if it's been fun for you all, but it's definitely been a ride for us. But I do appreciate everyone's patience, and let me say that because, again, this being the first reporting cycle, none of us really knew exactly what that meant. And as you were going through your own system, trying to understand how to pull out data, working with your IT, as well as we're working with our own programmers, as you know, we do come out with almost like a weekly update on, different things that we have identified throughout the process and trying to get it fixed to make certain that you can get through your files. I know that this next reporting process should be a little bit more easier because, again, all of us have an idea. The data elements aren't going to change, and so that helps you know exactly what you're looking for to pull out. And so I definitely want to thank Tanya as well because, like Tanya and I think we talk every single night until like midnight about FADS. So we're definitely there with you. We leave so at any point in time that you all need assistance, especially for those who are still out there trying to get their file validated, we are here to assist and help. But I think it's a wonderful opportunity for that data collection subcommittee to come back together again so we can look at the descriptions for those 113 elements to make sure that they're clearer for this next reporting cycle, so that way it's a lot easier for you to understand how to pull out that data.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Deshae and Tanya. Okay, we're at agenda item J, the FAAC student representation transition. We are very fortunate that our committee has student participation and representation. Their feedback is very valuable, and Matt has been in our committee for 2 years, and this is actually his last day, his last meeting, and so we want to thank you for your dedicated service. And so for Matt, we have a certificate for you.
Come on over.
So come on up so everybody can see you. And a letter. Yes. Oh. And actually, you get a mug from Chad and the coordinating board.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And this is a certificate of appreciation presented to Matthew Vandermouse.
Yeah.
Okay. And it says, thank you for your involvement as a member of the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board Financial Aid Advisory Committee. And it's signed by the chairs, me and Diane and Delisa.
Okay.
And then we also are giving you a photo.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot for having me. I really appreciate it.
We appreciate your service again,
Yes,
so
ma'am.
thank you very much.
All right. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. And so I am happy to announce that we will have a new student representative, and his name is Jonathan Ceredes. I'm not sure how to pronounce his last name, but it's Cereces, and he is from the University of Texas at El Paso. So he will be joining us in our June meeting.
And one quick thing that I wanted to add to that is, once again, we did not receive any nominations from any students at two-year institutions. So we will go into a cycle of trying to find a representative from two-year institutions, given that we rewrote the rules indicating that one of our slots is specifically for a student from two-year institution.
Okay, and again, Matt, we will miss you, so thank you. Okay, the next item is the FAAC nomination process. So, Chad, you're on.
Thanks.
Again.
In the materials that were sent out before the meeting, we put a draft of the letter that will be sent to nominees that are selected for the slate. The reason that we sent that out was mostly because I wanted to, we added language into the fourth paragraph that helps articulate the expectations that we have of members. Attending the meetings, ideally in person, reviewing materials in advance, attendance expectations, things like that. Wanted to make sure that that was clear for people who are nominated to this organization. So wanted to make sure that you all knew what we were passing out to the nominees. In reading through that nomination letter, did anyone have any questions or comments about how that letter should be edited? I'll take that as a no. Then the nomination process is also stapled to the front of that letter. And so if you look in the section regarding community membership breakdown, I just wanted to point out that the bullets have some information about how we are working to get the information out to the community about the nomination process. And so, in addition to sending the letters to the presidents and chancellors of all of, oh, and I apologize, there's a typo in this. It says, presidents and chancellors of all Texas independent higher education institutions. It's just supposed to say higher education institutions. It's not just the independent. Sorry about that. That wasn't right. But we send it out via Gov Delivery, which is our mechanism for getting, it's how you get your FAQ information to the presidents and chancellors. We also send it out to our financial aid directors lists. We also send it out to the TASFA listserv to let people be aware. And then in terms of the school districts, we send information out to the Texas Association of Secondary School Principals and the Texas Association of School Administrators and ask them to disseminate that accordingly. And then in terms of the TASFA representative, we just work directly with the president of TASFA each year to find out who their representative is going to be. Does anyone have any additional suggestions on avenues that you would think we'd be using but we aren't using to try to get the word out about nominations?
I just have a comment, because you mentioned about the 2 years. So I think part of being on the committee, we could advocate on our campuses, correct, for student representatives and nominating and so forth.
Yeah, and that's when we were doing the student representative, I had passed out the information to everyone to say, here's the nomination process, please be aware.
We need to be more active in that area for the student representative in general. And even
If you aren't already, yes, I would say that whatever's happening currently is not getting anyone from the 2-year institutions. We did have a handful of.
Yeah. It's really up to us to kind of work on that.
Yep.
Okay.
So I'm going to ask Matt a question. How did she find out about the committee?
So I received an email from, I don't even remember who the representative was at the school, that it was someone from the school, and they said that they're looking for, it's kind of a broadcast email sent out to the entire UNT Health Science Center just saying, we are looking for a student representative for FAAC. And that was really it. So, and I don't think they got, I was probably the only one, I think, that replied to that. It just, for whatever reason, sounded interesting to me. So, but something, whatever the process is, I don't think is working very well, because I think that this time, was there also a struggle attempting to get another student from a 4-year or like a health science? Was there any issue?
We did extend the deadline across all of our advisory committees, because as a whole, the advisory committees had a little bit lower in terms of turnouts, but after the extension, all the committees got, yeah.
Okay,
So-
I guess I mistook the extension for there was issue with, but okay.
But
so-
yeah, but it was across all of our advisory committees this time. But I will give that feedback to the people that are coordinating the student nomination process, because that's done for all advisory committees at once, to kind of let them know, A, how you found out about it, and B, that in general, we might need to be giving more guidance to whomever we're sending it to potentially give them suggestions on, are you forwarding it out to your entire community? What are you doing to try to make that?
Yeah,
So-
it probably could be marketed a little bit better if you're trying to get, volunteers or someone who wants to be on the committee. So how was it done for the 2-year institutions?
It's the same process.
Same
It's
thing.
sent out. The process is the agency notifies the institutions that the nomination process has opened, or when it'll be open. Each institution develops its own process for how it wants to select any nominations that are going to move forward. You know, there'll be maybe some institutions that only get one nomination and they forward it. There might be institutions that get multiple nominations and they have to determine, you know, how to narrow the scope to just move things forward. But it's the institutions that determine how are they going to go about collecting nominations for all of the advisory committees. I think there's 5 total that have the student piece to it.
Okay.
So, but I can definitely get feedback to the people who do the announcement to the institutions of what could we do to kind of nudge institutions more in terms of communicating it out to their students.
Has any consideration or talk been about changing how long a student from a 2-year would serve on the committee? Because, I mean, if they're at a 2-year college and they're selected before they start, I mean, it's like it wouldn't just, timeline, it just wouldn't really work very well.
That whole discussion occurred with this committee, and I pointed out that exact thing about I'm not sure that this is going to work, and the committee felt very strongly the 2-year requirement, the 2-year minimum, I have to go back. I know it's in rule. It may even be in statute that it needs to be a 2-year.
Right.
I'd have to figure out whether it's a statute or a rule in terms of the time frame for a student. So it would impact, like we couldn't have a special carve out just for financial aid.
Oh, I see.
Because the student representatives, it relates to all of the committees.
Okay.
I would just like to ask, so the position for the 2-year schools, is that open now? Someone could be nominated and start for the next meeting?
Yeah.
Okay. We'll work to get a nomination.
But and one thing you're talking about to going out, maybe what we need to do, and you should be engaging with, you know, your 2-year colleges, your 4-year HSIs and everything, when these nominations and we get information, because we have direct connections to our student government groups and to our student groups on campus, and we can advocate to send that information out to ask for these students if they would be interested so that we could submit nominations. And you can do that even if you work in the financial aid office. So I think maybe people just thinking somebody else is going to do it, and so then no one takes a hold of that. But we have access. There's most of the student groups and so forth they have advisors that we could tap into, and they have listservs and email addresses, so we can reach out to those groups as well. And maybe that just hasn't happened. Apparently hasn't happened.
Now, I would also wonder, like, one of the downsides to any student serving, probably not just community college, but I mean, is the institution willing to help them with travel expenses to get back and forth to a meeting?
Right.
I mean, coming from El Paso, this next person, I mean, if he's flying in, I'm assuming, 4 times a month, hopefully that school's helping them out. So that would be I don't know if
that's
you got
something that we
help or
put
not.
into the materials to make sure, because we do acknowledge that, no, we do not have funding to pay those costs. The agency can't cover it. And so we do make sure that we put into the materials that we don't have that. It does surprise me that we don't even get a nomination from Austin Community College that you could walk here from one of the campuses. So, but yeah, that is definitely a challenge. There is not funding. That piece is not going to change. But we do try to make sure that that is in the materials that go out so that institutions can provide support where possible.
Okay.
Another thing I will check is when we do the student nomination process, checked, I believe, but I'm not positive on this, I believe when that was sent out, that we also then took the announcement that was sent to the chancellors and presidents and sent that on to our mass gov delivery financial aid list and the TASFA listserv to let people know. So we will try to make sure that we're doing everything we can do to make sure the institutions know, but it is up to the institutions to actually do the process of gathering the nominations. One last piece on the nominations, just so that we're all clear. These are the individuals whose terms are ending this year. Doris Constantine's term was ending this year. Delisa Fox, Jeannie Gage, Sandy Jones, Chris Muir, Kathy Sanchez, and Brent Williford all have terms that are ending. So Brent's was short because he was filling the end of a vacated position. Did I read anyone's name who's surprised that I just read their name? Doris, Delisa, Jeannie Gage, Sandy Jones, Chris Muir, Kathy Sanchez, Brent Williford. Okay.
I was just asking Delisa if she's staying on because of TASFA.
Be as far as TASFA, but
Right, but not
Your
this.
term is ending if we do receive a nomination for you, which I will point out there's been times we haven't received the TASFA nomination and we've had to call and say, hey, are you guys planning on nominating anyone this year? You have to, yeah, because it's, you have to nominate to the position because we don't know. TASFA has a position on the committee. It is not in our rules that the TASFA president is that person. So TASFA has to tell us every year who is your representative, so we can't assume who it's going to be.
Okay, we'll take care of that.
Okay, and there is a note that persons who have previously served on the committee are eligible to serve again.
Yes, you can submit the nomination.
Okay, all right, thank you, Jan. And you're next.
I'm next too. So in terms of updates within our organization, financial aid services, I was basically going to mention fads. As to quote Tashay, all fads all the time. So that's really been the main thing. In borrower services, on February 26th, we implemented a new integrated voice response system to update our underlying structure for how calls come in. We not only updated our IVR system, but the agency as a whole replaced the entire phone system, which has already in just a week or so provided us with some very significant benefits to how we're able to redirect calls, utilize staff in better ways, minimize our wait times, and we haven't even, phase one was to kind of start with the base functionality that we had in our old IVR system, which wasn't that hard to hit because the old IVR system, we were happy if it rang every day. So we kind of started with that, and now we're looking at phase two of what are some of the enhancements. But like on the borrower side, one of the things it does for the borrowers is it now has that feature that you can, if the hold time is going to be too long, you can request that you keep your place in line and we just call you when your time is up. We don't have that on the financial aid services line or the TFAC hotline because we've been measuring, and for the first week, our average answer time on those two lines has been under 5 seconds. So if you can't wait 5 seconds, it's going to take you as long to press 1 as it is to wait the 5 seconds. So, but we are monitoring that very closely to make sure that we understand what the wait times and everything are. But we feel this is going to add a lot of service, especially in combination with the loan software we did last year to keep looking at how can we best benefit the borrowers and provide greater self-service. That's one of the big things that we're looking at in both areas is trying to provide greater self-service, trying to provide the opportunity for an institution to be able to go out and just see, okay, who does the coordinating board think I've awarded more money to so that I can make sure that I'm in line with them. I'm trying to be able to automatically just go see when is that money possibly coming in, when is it slated to come in, et cetera. The other thing in borrower services is in January, Rin and I set out our top priority, which was to hire 14 new staff members by July 1st. We needed to close the gap that had been created during the hiring freeze so that we could address the challenges we faced in the service levels. To date, we have hired 3 staff. Of the 14, we're about to make offers on 4 more staff for our collection specialists. Next week, we'll be interviewing for the payment tech positions, and we're also in the midst of reviewing the resume applications for the account representatives. So we are very close on 11 of those 14 positions. The final ones are our customer service reps. We wanted to get our new IVR system in and make sure we understood how it worked before we subjected someone else to our new IVR system. So now that that's in, we'll be posting the CSR. Hopefully by the end of the month, we'll be posting that. But we decided in January that that was going to be our, I call it our quest, that if we could get 14 more people into this building every day, that's going to significantly change how we can serve our borrowers. So we are moving along well. And then the final piece that I wanted to share with you in my constant effort to be more transparent about what we're doing in student financial aid programs is we finished off, I think I mentioned in our last meeting, we finished off the initial strategic plan that we created that covered 2016 and 2017. We had identified 14 objectives in that plan. I jokingly say we achieved 12 and a half of them. I don't give full credit on one of them, but I do give some credit because we made some good distance on it. So we were pretty pleased in terms of having completed so many of those objectives and making sure that the strategic plan kind of stayed at the forefront of what we do as opposed to something that, you know, got filed away in the desk and, you know, we kind of went to visit it later. Our strategic plan for the next 2 years is really focused on 2 areas. One is customer service metrics, and that is really developing better, not better so much as actually articulating how are we measuring our performance in relation to the customers, and then being transparent in our organization so that all of our staff know how we are meeting those. So the teams have been working right now on figuring out what are the things that customers would care about in the first place, and then what are even some of the operational things that we can't do this unless we do this. You know, the customer might not even know this is happening, but we still have to do it in order to meet this objective up here. So we're looking both from the institutional standpoint and from the borrower standpoint for our 2 units, financial aid services and borrower services, at customer metrics to try to better monitor those and stay on top of those. And then the second focus of our strategic plan is on project oversight. I described to people that the first strategic plan we had while I was here was about creating ideas. We had a lot of white papers, a lot of research of, you know, where do we want to be. This next strategic plan is about trying to turn those ideas into reality. And one of the challenges that we faced, that we discovered as we started to look at this during the first 2 years, is we definitely got into the habit of, that's a cool idea, let's do it. And we just kind of ran with it. And then later, like, IT would look at us and be like, okay, how do you expect us to do these 14 projects in the next 2 days? And we weren't really stepping back and assessing, okay, you know, what about priorities? What about, resources that are going to be needed? Who actually is going to be impacted? What's the breadth of, what's the scope of the project and the breadth of impact? We were just so excited when we'd find something that we're like, we can fix something. Let's go fix it. So now we're trying to spend more time really thinking about, okay, you know, during the first strategic plan, we literally came up with over 70 ideas of things that we feel are going to improve the service that we can provide. We can't do 70 things in the next month. We have to think about which things are really going to focus. So internally, we have a committee now that really looks at all the ideas, whether they came from our strategic plan, whether they came from a white paper. We have an internal program called Bright Ideas, where staff can submit suggestions on things that they think would help the customers. And we review those and look at kind of what's the impact. And then we have ones, everything goes into what we call our parking lot, that we assess based on our 4 main goals. Our 4 main goals within the organization are compliance is the first one. Sorry about that, got my own thing wrong. Compliance, customer, communication, and culture of excellence. Those are our 4 main pieces. So we categorize everything around that, and then we categorize around high, medium, and low. And then we figure out, okay, which are the things that we really, of all these, we want to assess these ideas first to figure out, can these move into an implementation phase where we work to try to actually make those things occur. And I thought it would be a good thing for us to share with you our project oversight document. Not so much, I'm not going to go through 9 pages word by word and tell you, but just so that you all have that resource. And so I plan on sharing it with you each quarter so that you can look at it, see where we're prioritizing our efforts, and provide you with an opportunity, whether in this venue or just calling me or sending an email, if you're seeing things that you're wondering, why are they prioritizing that way? If you're feeling like, I feel like I've mentioned how critical this is, but they don't seem to be getting it because they've got it, on the low section, or, vice versa. We told them that really wasn't important. Why is it? I want you to be able to raise those questions to help guide us, because we might be thinking about something from one, there's been at least one that we've been kind of thinking this way, and then all of a sudden someone's brought up and said, oh, but what about how it does this thing over here? And we hadn't even caught that connection. So I just want to be more transparent with you about what we're doing, so that way you have an opportunity to provide input if you think there are things that are more critical for your students, especially as borrowers, or whether you think there are things that are more critical for your institutions that maybe we haven't really seen. So that's the background. In future meetings, I will not go into that much about this, but I do plan on sharing it with you every quarter.
Thank you, Chad. Do you have any questions for Chad about any of his updates?
I just want to comment, I appreciate you sharing this and kind of showing kind of what y'all lined out. And I know you've done a lot, since you've come on board with the teams here. And so, but this is nice to have and kind of see that vision and then when things come to fruition. So thank you for sharing.
You're welcome.
Okay, we're down to the end. We're now at the adjournment. But before I ask for a motion to adjourn, I wanted to see if there was anything else the committee wanted to discuss or if you had any questions. And if not at this time, I would just encourage you to reach out to me or Chad for future agenda items. Also reach out to your colleagues. We're here to represent the other schools and to provide valuable feedback. So if there's anything in the future, our next meeting is going to be June 7th. Okay. All right, then I'm going to ask for a motion to adjourn the meeting. Do I have a first motion? Chris?
Second.
Robert, second. All in favor? Aye. Say aye. Okay, the meeting has been adjourned, and the time is 12:32. Thank you.
you.